Visions of the Old West color every kind of media, from films to comic books to video games. As a genre of fiction, it's foundational to the American mythos and persists long past its inception, skirting at the edges of the modern mind, but firmly interwoven, unshakable, a touchstone of American culture, an undispellable ghost. For some Americans, the Wild West is, as perverse as it is to say, history. Which shouldn't be the case and sounds absurd, but education's on the decline now, and we don't talk enough about how cowboys were mainly cattle herders and that most settlements had gun control, and that many aesthetic markers of the Old West, wide-brimmed hats and bandanas, were passed down from cultural intermingling with Mexicans who occupied swaths of the South because a huge chunk of the American South was once Mexico, and Americans adopted horseback cattle herding practices from Mexican vaqueros, basically cowboys, who further adopted that tradition from Spaniards colonizing Central America at least a century before the time of the Old West. Because a guy fanning the hammer is like, really cool, man. The reality of the American frontier is unflattering, it's inconvenient. It doesn't lend itself to legend very well. And what is America really, if not a lie the size of a blimp? Of course, there's another side of the Old West, one that paints with the deep black of a frontier night and the stark red of spilled blood, one that conjures demons from the very hearts of fearful men. The Weird West. The name lacks the oomph of the Wild West. It's a very YouTube name. The Weird World of the Weird West. Actually, and me though, it's a subgenre birthed at the fringes of Western media. It doesn't matter what the aesthetic core of your fiction is, eventually someone's gonna want to shove zombies in there. That's the basic idea. Take the Old West, its tropes, its aesthetics, its mythology, and paint the thing over with slime, blood, ectoplasm. Trip the Old West up with enough weird to pass as new, interesting, entertainment. It's a uniquely American subgenre, and for good reason. To tell it short, the Weird West is pulp fiction, or was, anyway. Cheap, engaging, mass-producible. While the name doesn't pop up until the 1970s with DC's Weird Western tales, you can trace the concept back to the 1930s, where Wild West tropes were paired with the trappings of other genres in comics, serials, and B-flicks. At its core, Weird West material was born from the muck nearly 100 years hence, and is settled now as a subgenre that nobody really thinks very much about. But in fewer words, because nobody talks about it. Looking online will produce a wealth of material in blogs and journals, but in video format, the most accessed source of online information, God help us, you'll be met mainly with reviews for the game Weird West, the rare, incredibly thin history of the Weird West video, and even videos attributing the term Weird Western to revisionist westerns, an entirely separate subgenre of westerns that emerged in the 1970s. The history is rich, but information is scattered, meaning the Weird West has no real home in the collective public consciousness. And recently, the subgenre found a home in a medium that didn't exist at the time of its own inception: video games. The actually weird thing, and not the vampires, not the werewolves, guys, is what the games say and what they mean. In many cases, they leverage the pulp identity that defined the Weird West and use the unique strengths of the video game medium to turn this humble, for fun sort of material into something impactful. But this is a story built on history, so we need to lay the foundation. The Western. To quote The Black West by William Loren Katz, in 18th century France, Voltaire wrote, "If the American frontier did not exist, it would have had to have been invented." In 19th century England, Lord Bryce called it the most American part of America. Early in the 20th century, President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed, "A frontier people is, so far, the central and determining fact of our national history." It's a genre too expansive to contain in a series of sentences. Many have tried, all will fail, but to put it bluntly, Westerns are the defining fiction of the United States. Dusty plains, beating sun, leather, iron, and blood. Tales of drifters armed with six-shooters laying out whole gangs of devious bandits and saving trains from robberies all color the filmic tradition of the American frontier. You've seen Western media, and you will experience something inspired by it again in your lifetime. I feel like I don't need to spend time evoking the exact image because it was already there, even when you were a child. If you pulled up a list of westerns from comics to film, you'd be scrolling down until dark. If I fully explained the history of the Western, it would take multiple videos. Tales of the Old West only ever maintained a passing connection to the truth by design. Directors didn't turn cattle herders into dead-eye marksmen to reveal the harsh realities of frontier life. They were trying to escape it, spin stories that romanticized a frankly miserable time and place to be alive. Nothing but mud, guns, and dirt. I think someone said that once. Not sure who, though. Tall tales like Johnny Appleseed and Paul Bunyan act as the mythological origin of a relatively young nation, the core of the oral tradition of storytelling in America. Paul Bunyan's so foundational, the Ojibwe people incorporated him into their own folk tales. He's so foundational, they gender-swapped him and put him in Magic the Gathering. Even got the blue cow and everything, damn. Many tall tales wouldn't be published past mere word of mouth until the early 1900s, though, and the burgeoning frontier that carried Paul Bunyan onto words along the winds created many more legends that we've carried forward into modern times. Tales of high plains drifters armed with a pair of six-shooters and grit, hard men in hard times, a smirk, a cig, and something to fight for. Stories of folks like Deadwood Dick, James Bowie, Texas Ranger, and Calamity Jane have captured the imaginations of generations of readers and writers alike, leading to their emblemization as archetypes of the Old West: the rider, the lawman, the gunslinger, and so many more. A lot of people only have a passing familiarity with the Western, which is why it's important to hammer a brief history out plain. Wouldn't want to leave you in the dust, partner. Now, as a dungeon master, I have a free pass to do terrible accents, and they'll call me a hero for it. You might think of spaghetti westerns like Fistful of Dollars as representative of the genre, and that's partially true. It's one of the most famous films ever produced. It features plenty of foundational western archetypes, and The Man with No Name still influences modern video games to this day. But the Dollars trilogy and other spaghetti westerns were filmed from 1964 and on, which leaves an enormous 60-plus year gulf between it, the common modern image of old westerns, and the original western films. Filmed western material stretches back even further than 1903's Great Train Robbery, which itself is based on a British production, but it's effectively the birth of a genre in terms of construction. As Feenan and Everson illustrate in The Western From Silence to Cinerama, the Great Train Robbery set the pattern of crime, pursuit, and retribution for the western film as a genre. Justice, often expressed through revenge, is one of the emotional pillars of the western. While westerns were popular during the silent film era, 1894 to 1927, the advent of sound in film left Hollywood scrambling to even greater heights, and large studios abandoned the genre to smaller studios, penny producers. So piles of lower-budget, B-grade western flicks littered screens throughout the 30s. By the time the western was most easily producible, it was pulp. But history has a way of making itself relevant again, and by the end of the 30s, several extremely popular westerns dominated box offices: Dodge City, Union Pacific, Jesse James, Stagecoach. By the 1950s, the western resurged so powerfully that their sheer number outpaced every other genre of film combined. The western was, for all intents and purposes, foundational American media. This is all preceding spaghetti westerns and eventually revisionist westerns, which were produced and popularized after the relaxation and eventual collapse of the Hays Code. Because no media history is complete without a read on the socio-economic situation. The Hays Code, or Motion Picture Production Code, was a board-determined set of film industry guidelines for self-censorship in the United States of America, and applied to most of the major film studios from 1934 until the eventual collapse of the MPPDA. It had no official enforcement mechanism, of course, so racy material still crept onto the big screen from time to time, but the money people wanted to play it safe wherever possible, and so self-censoring became the gold standard during the Western's golden era. The code specifically reads, beyond its insipid little list of points, the following: no picture should lower the moral standards of those who see it. We feel the reverberations of this concept today. Video game violence begets real-life violence from the now disbarred Jack Thompson. We have rating systems that act as buffers against children getting access to, like, Resident Evil, which surely did not stop me at 13. I have, myself, censored my own swear words across over 100 YouTube videos to future-proof my work against rapidly changing policies in the face of a corporation that does not care. And I've never really felt comfortable or privileged enough to uncensor that work until very recently. What exactly counts as appropriate viewing material remains an eternal specter in all discussions of art even today. Create a YouTube video and swear. A self-righteous 12 to 36-year-old will be very upset with you, I promise. The specifics of the Hays Code are fairly frustrating, but illustrate exactly why stories about the Old West deserve inspection. The Hays Code prohibited pointed profanity either by title or lip, including the words God, Lord, Jesus, Christ, hell, SOB, damn, any licentious or suggestive nudity, the illegal traffic in drugs, any inference of perversion, white slavery, miscegenation, sex hygiene and venereal diseases, scenes of actual childbirth, children's parts, ridicule of the clergy, willful offense to any nation, race, or creed. The code is frustrating because there's an ounce, the tiniest ounce, of good in the making. Willfully offending races of people and their faith is generally bad behavior and, given the right context, discrimination. Canada doesn't have blanket free speech because reasonable limitations are written into the legislation, which acts as a protective measure against explicit hate speech, for example, because soft oppression, making an environment deliberately inhospitable for someone, still qualifies as oppression. But profane words, that is, heavy hitters like damn, any kind of titillating imagery, depictions of specifically white slavery, which in its time referred to depictions of white women enslaved in harems, and miscegenation, interracial relations, were considered equally offensive as some of these other things. The Hays Code is a relic of its time and is not remembered fondly. It ensured a media landscape that reinforced white Christian values, and more than those basic rules, it also limited the nature of opposition in film. Evil, the bad guys, were never supposed to be sympathetic. Crime shouldn't be explained in detail. It was a paper-thin culture that, even for directors working cleverly within those constraints, could not transcend and speak truly to the human experience by design, or at least not without breaking the rules. Even things as human as addiction and sexuality were often glossed over explicitly to preserve the moral fiber of the work in the eyes of the board. If you ever wondered why subtlety is so fetishized in the West, the Hays Code is just another cultural pillar, wrong-headed as it was, that led to Western art being so profoundly reserved by design. But the Western was even further strapped by incredibly limited potential for actors who weren't white. Producers knew Southern theaters wouldn't show pictures with prominent or heroic black actors, and so black actors were reduced to comedic and subservient roles. Mixed-race reality was entirely ignored. The actual demographics of the very era the films approximated were distorted in frame because of this code. Indeed, African-American actors were often limited to race films, that is, tight-budget movies with African-American casts targeted specifically to African-American communities, because Hollywood wouldn't enshrine black people as people in the emerging lineage of American film. Some mixed-race actors adopted the affectations of whiteness or attempted to appear whiter with product for a greater chance at being seen as not black. This history is messy and incredibly wide scope, quite literally intersecting with all modern American history, but to make it crystal clear, the Western was sweeping, foundational American media, the Western was palpably flat because of the Hays Code, and the Western was predominantly white. These characteristics unraveled into the mid-60s and 70s with spaghetti westerns and eventually revisionist westerns, which poked fun at the stilted, simplistic, and hokey Western stories that dominated screens for so long. The West got weird because directors were sick of what they historically represented. Up until now, we've looked at the roots of Western film, which is mandatory reading because the Weird West is an offshoot, a subgenre, and kind of aqueous by design. So let's try to pin it down anyway. Weird Western refers to anything that would typically parse as Western, time period, archetypes, tropes, etc., with the addition of horror, science fiction, or fantasy elements. At some point, the term Gothic Western was coined to specifically reference Westerns with recognizable horror elements like vampires and zombies. Sci-fi Western was coined for that, but this kind of atomization seems unhelpful, hence the blanket term, Weird West. The Horror from the Mound is a very early Weird West tale about killing a vampire. The Circus of Dr. Lao is less horror and more fantastical, featuring captive mythological creatures and ancient rituals. Many North Americans have already engaged with the Weird West and not realized it. 1999's Wild Wild West has a big stupid idiot robot spider, and yeah, that qualifies. But the Weird West isn't just about jamming some totally unnecessary genre into the West like a square peg through a round hole. Sure, pulp Weird West material is widespread and common. The Phantom Empire might as well be a comic book come to life with its futuristic underground city and big blocky robots, but others were more tapped into the mystical. Riders of the Whistling Skull was only partially supernatural, still dominated by skin and bone cowboys in conflict with each other, but fixated on a lost city of gold. Fairly low weird altogether. Fantasy elements lend a magic realism quality to that brand of weird Western material, tapping directly into the quintessential playfulness that created the American tall tale, which the Western is firmly rooted in. Sci-fi Westerns pit old-era cowboys against forces impossibly beyond their era and knowledge, exuding a sense of anxiety and hopelessness in the face of changing times, a very real and understandable human fear, something echoed in other times in other places, like the way certain Japanese media romanticizes and ruminates on the end of the era of samurai. Gintama, a gag series, ultimately draws on that very fear of loss and change to fuel its drama and pathos. Of course, for most Weird West material, the horror is whatever monster is trying to kill the hero. Historically, though, Weird Western films were hampered by the same constraints that limited regular Westerns: the Hays Code, poor representation, and an inability to speak candidly about the human experience. Even if the West could be weird, it wasn't really diverse. Few Weird Western films were produced during the golden age of the Western. We get 1959's Curse of the Undead, but for presenting as horror, it's highly particular about avoiding blood, really anything that wouldn't fit in a child's diorama of the Old West. 1956's The Beast of Hollow Mountain is about shooting a T-Rex. Weird Western material is kind of pulp by design. You don't just smash two things together and call it art. You can, but you're still going to catch the side eye of other artists intentionally creating from less pastiche base materials, people inventing and exploring outside of the base constraints of established genre. And it's not like the bulk of it is brain genius stuff. By the way, Billy the Kid shoots Dracula isn't exactly artistically inspiring. Might get a hell yeah. Might be fun with a beer. Probably not gonna stick with most people past their next bowel movement, but that doesn't mean the Weird West isn't art, even if it's historically been perceived as lesser art. Just look back to the Western. Simply by existing as a genre of film and getting passed over for a time by Hollywood before its golden age, the core of the Weird West, the West, was considered too passé to bother with. And even still, real human heart is etched into those kind of hokey, kind of bad pieces anyway. B stuff has a place, and will always find an audience no matter how small, because it so often exists without the restraints imposed by the money people. The higher up you go in some mediums, the tighter the purse strings. And so the Weird West lived on for decades in films, comic books, and eventually another burgeoning medium, games, or tabletop games, anyway. I've been rotating the Weird West in my mind for a little over 2 years, and mostly because of tabletop games, and specifically Deadlands. It's worth mentioning that Deadlands came about because the author, Shane Hensley, was inspired by a supplement to the broader World of Darkness tabletop series, which goes back to '91. Most famous Weird West films were the products of a withering Hays Code, hence the swell through the 70s and on. It's not particularly surprising that the Weird West eventually found a home on the tabletop. The basic premise isn't complicated. In Deadlands, you play as a created or pre-generated character in a fictionalized, alternate history vision of the American frontier. While the specifics change in different editions, I'm most familiar with the 2021 Savage Worlds Adventure edition of Deadlands, featuring a version of history where, quote, "The Civil War dragged on far longer than in our history. A devastating earthquake in California revealed a kind of superfuel dubbed ghost rock because of the way it howls when burnt, and that material led to technological advances that make the inclusion of futuristic concepts possible. New nations arise, an alternate history is written, and players are left in rapidly changing times that still smack of the historical trials and tribulations of the Old West. It goes beyond steampunk and sci-fi, of course. In the Sioux nations, for some reason, machine engines sputter and fail, guns slowly degrade or disassemble, even wagon wheels pop off the hinge. Some supernatural force quite literally rejects technology in a huge, vaguely defined area. Add to this the sudden swell of zombies, creatures, and other supernatural enemies, and Deadlands is clearly set to provide a dungeon master with any desired flavor of the Weird West. Outside of these setting particulars, Deadlands is about the same across its various editions. Gamblers, card sharps known as hucksters, tap into magical powers, deal with the devil, as it were, to fight against unholy abominations. Gunslingers fan the hammer and sock lead into any old shambling beast that gets too close. So many archetypes, ripped straight from Western legend, come alive in this romanticized version of a real historical setting. Creatures, rangers, what you might recognize as a voodoo witch doctor, an ungun. It's enough to trick an outsider into believing it's basically like Dungeons and Dragons, heroic fantasy. But Deadlands is highly lethal by comparison, or can be. The version of the rules I've used, the Savage Worlds framework, has exploding dice, meaning if you hit the highest die total on any given roll, you roll again and add the sum, which can lead to incredible blowouts, searing the whole head off an enemy if they're unlucky, or the player if they're unlucky. Don't worry, you can mitigate the swingy nature of the game. You get these poker chips, bennies, short for benefits, like from the government, handed to the players at the start of the game, and wherever the marshal, the dungeon master, thinks you've been an extra special good boy or something. Benny's the marshal dealing with the devil. The game is trussed up with the trappings of the Old West. It's aesthetically satisfying, kind of quaint, but the exact kind of chewy, flavorful thing you might want if you like the Old West and like tabletop RPGs. If you're intimately familiar with these kinds of games, you'll know that players come in waves, and most of them come in with whatever edition of Dungeons & Dragons is current. Some groups expand and actually engage with other systems, but many tables are stuck in the dungeons and doldrums until their local game withers away and they move on to something else. For me, Deadlands was something I fell into, looking for something, anything different, and it's an entire story on its own. Deadlands is the brainchild of Shane Lacey Hensley, who wrote the earliest version for a 1996 release. If you're a newer era Dungeons & Dragons player, the kind who blew in for 5th edition, you might be aware that older games tended to be crunchier, more mechanically complex, more mechanically specific. While systemic streamlining isn't new to Dungeons & Dragons, or 5th edition for that matter, the fact is that as game designers designed games, they repeatedly came to the conclusion that there wasn't enough money backing their games and that complexity had to be a limiting factor. And they aren't wrong about that, necessarily. Complexity has fully kneecapped heaps of games, entire genres from any kind of mass market appeal. And it's an even bigger struggle for tabletop RPGs because, frankly, asking not only one person, but an entire table to meet on the same day and then learn an entirely new set of rules is a bigger ask than you might think. There are people, to this day, who will tell you to your face that a sure you can input a dragon punch motion in a fighting game is too much to learn, and therefore fighting games cannot be fun inherently. There are people who won't do so much as reading a short build guide for a new champion in League of Legends, because they'd rather hit play instantly and fail for 20 to 40 minutes, not really knowing what they're doing, instead of spending 10 minutes in training mode figuring things out and coming to class prepared. And don't forget, as a team member, that's your burden to carry. It's no surprise then that as new Deadlands editions were published, the game became increasingly streamlined, helped along by its adoption into both the GURPS and Savage World core systems. It was interrogated and reconsidered multiple times. This streamlining off-put old-time players to an extent. Savage Worlds isn't everybody's shot of whiskey, and Deadlands was originally defined by its craft. And some of that identity was sanded away to make the thing half palatable to casual newcomers, but that assumes Savage Worlds isn't inherently jarring on its own, walking in from just 5e, and it totally is. So let's neutrally approach the game as though it's sufficiently respectful to its origins and taking strides to pay attention to detail, set the tone. You're not quite an action hero and you're going to have to do some work to keep up. That's characteristic of the Weird West, drawn out of a genre so often characterized by heroes boldly facing the swarming opposition and succeeding every time. The Weird West is instead defined by the gravity of the opposition, the crushing weight of the evil the heroes face. They can't simply face hordes of zombies down like it's a local gang of thugs. Oftentimes, the hero is therefore reduced, made to win with wits or specific critical actions more than their raw ability to hit targets. Deadlands does something interesting, both mechanically and narratively, in the fear system. The world is dangerous, monsters are real threats and not simply myth, because the fabric of reality between the material world and the spirit world was irreparably damaged with the arrival of settlers in the West, and so we get fear. A region-spanning mechanical penalty determined by the marshal that reduces player ability as represented by a net negative to any given roll, depending on the relative fear level found in the region. The fear level is again marshal determined and correlates to the amount of danger present in the zone. Rumors of a monster killing people in the night might register at fear level 2, for example. Players can offset the fear level by triumphing against whatever the major task is, eradicating the source of the problem, killing the werewolf, whatever, and crucially, telling the story to NPCs in town. Speak their own deeds into myth. Actions, which become stories, become strength. The really interesting thing about Deadlands, though, is the relationship between fear and monsters. This is spoiler territory if you're a player in a Deadlands game, so proceed with caution. Human fear is a major source of power for the setting's villains, the Reckoners, who've come from the spirit world to wreak havoc across the plains. Their own creatures stir up fear in humans, which in turn generates more power for the Reckoners to manifest monsters. It's an apocalyptic, self-fulfilling cycle of terror. Human suspicion, fear, and hatred, according to Deadlands, fuels the very monsters that materially harm them and their communities, which is not a particularly subtle look at American history. It acts as a sweeping critique of human nature and the American myth. In Deadlands, the West might have been spared untold strife and torment if only anyone hadn't approached an already inhabited part of the world with all of the entitlement colonizers did. The West might have been spared further perpetual strife and torment if people approached one another empathetically, if they sought first to understand before acting, if they weren't greedy and violent and cruel, if they made allies in an expanse so vast it's hysterical to imagine needing to fence it off from the undesirables, if they saw others as unique individuals birthed no differently than themselves instead of as caricatures, if they settled in instead of plundering the earth for everything they could, brief flashes of riches that could never satiate a lifelong hunger for more. The horror of the Weird West in Deadlands is people. Deadlands is a game in conversation with itself. The author penned the original version and is also the author of the most modern edition. The Savage Worlds edition contains a decent amount of commentary on the expectations people have of these kinds of settings, specifically about the nature of Western tropes, and thereby acknowledging the way previous versions could accidentally maybe reduce people to caricature. It also has explainers on things like women, who, the books acknowledge, were historically denied equitable treatment, but in the setting, history changed, and changed their effective role in society. This is important for a very specific kind of player. If you're tapped into tabletop spaces, you're aware of the propensity for people in those spaces to be powerfully, irredeemably toxic about the need for realism in their fantasy fiction. In the name of verisimilitude, believability, the fiction with magical wishes, where almost every main character is hot. A lot of work's been done in modern tabletop publishing to not publicly enshrine fantasy racism and sexism as inherently necessary to the most popular tabletop settings. Oh man, I already mentioned the S word and the R word, and it's only been 20 minutes. Well, you can include it. You can ask your table about it, but it's not as supported or encouraged per the rules as written as it once was. I think that's the stumbling block a lot of very loud people stub their toe on. It's your game and you're free to do whatever you like with it, but we're learning as a civil society and trying to not be innately exclusionary and repulsive to people who've lived different lives than us. Clumsy depictions of racism hit differently depending on the lived experiences of the players. It's not a condemnation of your personal table and how how you like to run things. It's being publicly responsible with a wildly popular game, being publicly responsible with part of a generation's foundational media. Of course, that's the kind of uncontroversial nuance that confuses and angers people, but that's basically my job, calmly and supportively explaining why something is. And really, that was my first mistake. I like Deadlands' penchant for self-awareness. It doesn't go the full mile. Critics have mentioned that the book frequently uses the Algonquin term Manitou, referring only in the text to evil spirits, which is incorrect, and by sampling that word incorrectly, effectively spreads misinformation, but the heart's where it needs to be. The Confederacy still loses, and a lot of it doesn't read as Confederacy apologia like previous editions could. It's a book, a game in conversation with its own history, and changing attitudes about American history. Tabletop games are only one kind of game, often collective group storytelling, which is absolutely true of Savage Worlds and Deadlands in particular, thanks to its bennies. But what about video games? The solo interactive play version of the Weird West is a pretty scant history, but it's got tales of its own worth telling. And since the Weird West is a subgenre, we've got even more context to grapple with. The Weird West is a subgenre, so we can look back at its birth genre, even in the video game medium, for clues that inform the subgenre. Western games are pretty common. It's an easy genre to translate into the medium, at least on paper. No inherent need for complex melee animations, everyone's got a gun. No real need for flashy effects. We're emulating the real world, even if it's born from a kind of flaccid and unconvincing version of American history. But video games were historically hampered by low-fidelity hardware that restricted the possible visions of the West that could ever feasibly manifest. Not needing complex character melee combos is one thing, but now you need horses, woodland critters. The game can't really emulate reality, or single bullets would be devastating. Game ending. Console unplugging, but towing the line on verisimilitude is also suddenly very important, because this is a romantic version of a historical setting with a lot of audience-anticipated baggage. Will you put swinging saloon doors in your game? Will you feature the buntline special? Will there be rope mechanics in your game? And if so, good luck programming that shit. Suddenly, the Old West is a bit of a headache, and incredibly likely to pan out stale. Some of the greatest Western games ever released only released directly in line with greater leaps in hardware fidelity. You don't get Red Dead Redemption without crunch-mandated labor poured into powerful engines that can support complex, realistic animations, all of the necessary detail, and with graphical capabilities advanced enough to make flat rural America innately compelling. Give players a reason to wander into the bush. While I've pushed against the fetishization of graphical fidelity and more powerful hardware on this channel for most of my time, Westerns are one of the genres that benefit the most from technological advancements. As we rush forward into the future, a species so utterly desperate to go back. It's why Assassin's Creed and its opulent historical settings are so successful. You could sell many of them as walking simulators to help ground budding historians in an approximation of the past. Ubisoft quite literally does this. Many successful Western games, Desperados 3 comes to mind, are the result of a decades-long effort to craft an experience. The original Desperados title was so successful and so visually striking because it cropped down the West into vital tactical play cast in this diorama-like frame, a miniature, a consumable snapshot of the Old West. And that tradition was carried forward into the tail end of the 2010s, issuing the prototypal, maybe unconvincing 3D segments. You play as all the same characters, maintained over decades. While Red Dead Redemption and Desperados do different things, one being about the coolest guy alive doming hordes of bandits like a legend of the Old West, and the other being about creeping in shadows to triumph against overwhelming odds, they both firmly cast the player as sympathetic, the victim of a corrupt and unjust world, often in search of revenge. They're deliberately and intentionally playing off the core aesthetic and emotional pillars that inform the genre. And hey, look at that. Mostly white male heroes, to neatly fit alongside all the other white man dude gun shoot protags of video games' second adolescence. That is, when games got really disgustingly intentional about maximizing appeal to their core demographic, because who the hell else cares about games? Surely not women. Surely not Black people. The key distinction between Weird West games and regular Westerns lies in the dynamic between protagonist and villain. Westerns are predominantly about good people or those in search of redemption, sympathetic human beings facing down tangible problems that most men couldn't beat back alone, but these men can, or with a little help. All this is said with an acknowledgement that the spaghetti and revisionist Westerns, the post-Hays Code Westerns, were more morally complicated, but often narratively justified their protags. The Weird West angle alters the paradigm a bit, at least in video games. Now it's really anybody's story. Hero, misfit, once villain. Context is everything, and these people are made to grapple with forces entirely beyond their mere mortality. Player sympathy is derived from the acknowledgement of their individual struggle rather than an acknowledgement of their righteousness. And that's basically the horror of the Weird West at play. Not every Weird West game makes use of horror in the strict sense, but will tap into more abstract horrors, rapidly advancing technology, illusion, impossibility, all kinds of pastiche takes on the setting. Horror is an empathetic genre, or at least that's the way scholars are increasingly talking about the genre. And that's maybe the most critical distinction between the Western and the weird growth it's sprouting. There's a greater focus on people, not just being a hero to others, but actually listening to them and hearing their stories, operating within their understanding, less emphasis on how badass the dude with the revolver is. The Weird West isn't exactly crucial for video games as a medium. It's actually the other way around. Video games have been crucial for the Weird West as a concept. Video games have also been considered a lesser art form, and still are, as of the writing of this video, to most people and almost anyone who didn't grow up with home consoles or handhelds. FIFA absolutely crushes Final Fantasy, and whatever other game an overtuned social media poster is calling the pinnacle of fiction. Basically anything I've talked about on this channel for the past 2 years. B-games dominate the sum total of all games ever made. Thin budgets and strapped resources are the norm, and creating video games is basically magic. If you've ever followed a solo game dev on the internet for any length of time and wonder why they're like that, it's because they're communicating with arcane forces at every moment of the day and unraveling quickly. Video games are also a young enough medium that the rules, as it were, are not firmly established. You can make a weirdo game, and no, people won't play it. They won't even understand it. But in 20 years, when that game is pointed to as a relevant piece of the medium's artistic history, naysayers will be met with the evil eye. How uncultured. How pedestrian. Video games are also a playful medium, quite literally. You play them, but I mean in the artistic sense as well. Form, structure, the core elements that constitute a game, a ludic experience, are more contextual than prescribed. In one game, it might make perfect narrative sense for a protagonist to never speak. In another, it might make more sense for that character to speak in text, mid-play barks, and fully voiced cutscenes. Play, and therefore narrative, are context-dependent. Video games can take completely unfamiliar forms or entirely established ones. Video games are a home for the Weird West, a medium where the inherent camp of haphazardly combined genres isn't tonally grating in any way. After all, we've been blasting monsters since the oldest, most time-honored video games. Freed from the need to present a particular way, Weird West material can blossom uniquely in video games, and more importantly, in this exact point in history. Video games aren't hamstrung by the Hays Code, even if the ESRB does a really mild impression. Video games aren't limited by embarrassing, old-world ideas about race and sexuality, even if their publishers and developers can be. And in more modern video games, more genuine, human stories can flourish. There aren't even very many Weird West games, but I think they're at the heart of contemporary American culture. And yes, it's taken about 40 minutes to get to the actual meat of the video, the proper start time. That is, if you consider all the historicizing and the lineages at play worthless information. But I think it's important in this video of all videos to highlight the way that history informs all things. The way that very little creativity exists on an island, in a vacuum. Most gamers' only exposure to the Weird West was a DLC, Red Dead Redemption's Undead Nightmare. It's a modest addition to a well-loved game with a suitably pulp premise. What if the surliest cuss in the West had to shoot zombies? Well, he already had to fight bureaucracy, so Can't say it's much of a challenge by comparison. And John Marston is a figure straight out of a spaghetti western. By the way, the anti-hero, the grizzled old misery guts, is something more common in those 1960 westerns and on. Django, the man with no name, it's a character ripped from more violent, grittier films than many of the original visions of the Old West, from the pantomime antics of the silent era to the singing brand of cowboy to the good-natured all-American kid of the golden era. It's a good fit. I like those ones too. I can't imagine making a Western game and not making fanning the hammer an option. Undead Nightmare is a worthwhile addition to the base experience, which itself is relevant to the Weird West. Red Dead Redemption is a certified Rockstar classic, and you could chalk a lot of that up to the details. The Old West captured in pristine HD. It's a dramatic game, but fairly no-nonsense in its mechanical attention to verisimilitude. It looks like a cowboy game, it feels like a cowboy game, it plays like a cowboy game. You spur your horse along dirt roads and your jump has some girthy startup frames, okay? You don't just pop up like... No, John here's gotta work into it. His knees aren't what they used to be, and he's not about to take on Ryu Hayabusa because, sure, old cowboy films might owe a lot to fantastical samurai flicks, but this is a fiction firmly rooted in a vision of reality. I'm actually kind of surprised John never contracts an illness and suffers with it. You can kill a rabbit and cook it. You can hogtie someone and watch him burst under a train. It is simultaneously ridiculous and entirely grounded in a way only the video game medium can accommodate. I appreciate that element of Red Dead Redemption, by the way. The West may be about the hero being the coolest, bestest guy, but it's also about attention to detail, setting the scene just so, right? Making sure people breathe in the Old West and immerse in the experience. I simply did not sign up for Samurai Western. I signed up for undulating horse balls. I get okay. But the entire era is also a bed of tall tales, and so even the base version of Red Dead Redemption leans into the incredible, the impossible, the supernatural. John can unload any gun like an Old West movie star, but it goes further. Across both Red Dead Redemption and its sequel, the player can meet a mysterious stranger, heavily implied to be the embodiment of death itself. In the solemn solitude of the High Plains, the line between fact and fiction blurs. It's part of the genre's appeal. So, Undead Nightmare is less an absurd, just-for-laughs addition. It's a critical piece of context that takes the genre's most appealing aspects, stories, legends, myths, to their logical extreme. You shoot the undead and cleanse towns as you thunder across the plains. Various cryptids, creatures from American myth, lurk in dark corners of the map, waiting to be discovered. The player can find and tame the four horses of the apocalypse.
Get over here! How do I... It's been a long time since I've done this before.
Like the base game, Undead Nightmare is a long-winded chase across a very large area to hunt down a series of characters who direct you to other characters so you can finally put a bullet between the right character's eyes and wrap up the plot. This particular adventure was sparked by a greedy powermonger robbing an Aztec tomb, thereby unleashing a zombie plague across the West. It isn't serious or impactful on its own, closer to campy and vaguely orientalist, but it's worth highlighting that Undead Nightmare takes the time to highlight many different kinds of people you meet in the base game, the people who make up this blossoming America.
He's a harmless old fraud, the kind of man that built this country.
It's worth noting that Red Dead Redemption 2 has no like DLC edition. You can't go painting the walls with zombie brains, but it's still keyed into that tradition and incorporates plenty of bizarro inclusions from vivisected abominations to UFOs. But these mostly land in Easter egg territory and don't really constitute a vision of the Weird West. It's why I chose to lead with Rockstar, actually. While their games engage with the history of the Western, and even the quieter chronology of the Weird West, they're more a beginner's course, more aesthetically interested than materially interested. Like, I bought this hat 6 months ago explicitly for this video. I was materially invested. But once I got writing the script, the yeehaw kind of got sucked out, as it were. Sometimes material investiture just isn't enough. Because the weird side of the West was only ever a secondary consideration, Red Dead Redemption is just an introduction, low scope, a primer to this collection. And before we get too deep into the Weird West's video games, I want to highlight that this is a fairly puny subgenre. Even in the gaming space, and many of the most successful Weird West games are fairly modern, as older developers, indie developers, and otherwise passionate people seek to do something interesting with a genre that's both rarely explored in the medium and culturally relevant to games as a whole. The history of Deadlands should make it plain, but even then, Deadlands is not the only expression of the West, or even the Weird West in a tabletop setting, and it's been a long point of interest for all kinds of games-minded people. Wildly obscure titles exist that even I'm not about to cover at length because I don't believe they speak meaningfully to the overarching thesis of this video. The PC-88 has a Cowboys and Cthulhu game, quite literally stapling the Cthulhu mythos onto the Old West, making it decidedly weird by design. Sorry, I don't mean to linger on this shot. I'm coming to terms with the fact that a man was hit with arrows and exploded. It's an ancient turn-based RPG and looks kind of similar to Deadlands. Cowboys and native warriors fight side by side against the encroaching darkness. It's just that, for tapping into Cthulhu, it somehow misses the entire insanity premise, the utter lethality of any kind of combat intrinsic to tabletop adaptations of the Cthulhu mythos, and instead lets you empty your barrel into evil insects. To be clear, a lot of characters die in cutscenes after boss fights. It's not totally anti-Cthulhu, it's just like they were really trying to make a playable level ups and items RPG out of that, so good luck. It's also excessively stereotypical. I don't expect quality representation of the indigenous peoples of America from 1992 Japan. I'd just rather remove it from the conversation because I don't think it has anything worthwhile to say, either about the Cthulhu mythos or about the Weird West. Weird West video games, maybe accidentally, spiritually mirroring Western film, took time to mature. Dark Watch is another obvious pull for this kind of collection, a 2005 shooter featuring a man with a wide-brimmed hat, the two-hand special, and decidedly gothic garb. It's almost appropriate, but the story is more interested in a villain looking to take over the world than launching any kind of inquiry into the Old West or really playing with its own premise, a Civil War vet known for hunting vampires. The specter of the B film is alive and well in video games, don't you worry, and they're fun for a quick play regardless. And some of the clumsier ones are still informative. Another that failed the vibe check is Oddworld: Stranger's Wrath. It effectively qualifies as a weird western by virtue of its gunslinging, Old West aesthetic, draped up with its own quirky Oddworld dressing, bug guns. But ultimately the game has nothing to do with America, and focus is helpful. This game starts in an approximation of the Old West. It's all in on the Old West aesthetic. It's on all the best Weird West video games lists online. And it ends in Viking Place. So some people are absolutely sweating over the omission of Hunt Showdown, but that game is mostly an online battle royale title, not as narratively driven as some of the games featured in this video, though there's something to say for selecting a character class and contributing cooperatively during a hunt. Glaring omissions aside, we need to take a moment to talk about a game that pushes the Weird West definition to its limit. Damnation.
This jumping angle should be illegal. Wait, no! What the?
Damnation is the product of two separate dev studios who created the game as a contest entry. It started as a mod of Unreal Tournament 2004 with the intent to fully branch off from the original source and attach as its own complete game. It is profoundly B. It might be C. It doesn't look quite like the other collected games, but it's decidedly Weird West by virtue of its alternate history approach, a la Deadlands, imagining an America wherein the Civil War stretched on for decades, influential inventors like Nikola Tesla and Benjamin Franklin being stifled, and another inventor, Prescott, becoming the most influential man in America through his exclusive arms supplier deal with the United States government. Capitalism, which so often leads to imperialism because both are fueled by expansionism, are the subject of critique even if the game doesn't use those words. Oh, I said the C word and it hasn't even been an hour yet. Well... Steam-powered technology became standardized in this setting, so combustion engines were never developed, and we're left with a dystopic, nearly modern, steampunk vision of the American frontier. Loudspeakers blare Prescott propaganda across industrial wastelands while the heroes shoot through military police in a vain effort to secure the town. It's a little rough to look at and not particularly enjoyable to play. Kind of feels like gum. But it still knows what it wants to communicate, and the stiff aesthetics actually manage to help sell the stifling setting better. It's grim. If not for the red brick, you'd think the game were trying to kill you with visual misery. Damnation reviewed terribly. Playing for about 10 minutes should reveal why. The game is not the worst thing ever made, but it's a fascinating example of 360-era design trends, gritty color palettes, third-person cover shooting play, and a healthy dose of platforming, all jammed together in a way that almost works, but never quite reaches hell yeah status. Something I think is really important, when the protag shoots guns and rides a motorcycle, or when the intro cutscene shows us the baddest guy alive in the whole entire world and he's armed with only a saber in this steampunk alt history universe.
Okay. Is this supposed to be like a cool guy character? Hey bro, take your ass back to JCPenney. You look disgusting. Oh, okay. I'm pretty sure I'm entitled to financial compensation for this.
You don't stay in the city for long, and you're quickly funneled into a dim mining operation which leads you to something resembling a rundown Old West settlement. You're aware that the West isn't lost, but a lot of the toxicity is centralized in industrialized areas and places where workers are exploited in comically evil fashion. Or completely realistic fashion, my bad. The steampunk core melds with the Weird West in a game that's at once completely absurd, but once again, like the old sci-fi Weird Westerns, thoroughly concerned with the future and what it means to displace humanity in the forward march of technology. That doesn't mean the game's handling of people is informed by curiosity, though. Damnation is not particularly innovative with its use of the mystical. You come across a native medicine man with powers, one of the lead character's siblings, and you're quickly able to tap into those powers yourself, letting you see through walls and catch glimpses of the future, which is helpful when the AI is trained on you 24/7. It's a clumsy kind of inclusion. We've got the pale John Johnman over here cracking skulls and even getting magical powers basically for free, while this heavily tattooed, emaciated dude mutters in a cave. It leans a little too close to Orientalism to be a graceful portrayal, especially when his own sister, an ally of the hero and supporting party member, has effectively abandoned that way of life, clearly choosing to integrate with modern society as a fighter. It reads like, yeah, Kay, hand over your ancestral wisdom and power. Awesome, thanks. Rot in your cave, moron. Orientalism is so common for developers, most artists really, taking a crack at Native American culture because nobody actually bothers to ask them about anything, really. Something 2022's Weird West managed to duck in part by actually engaging with consultants on representation. And that's an entirely fictionalized version of the West. But anyway, here's a quick educational segment for people who are bristling or have never heard the term Orientalism before. It's a basic academic criticism with plenty of literature, frankly, that also applies to video games, comic books, films, media in general. Think Borderlands 2's infamous DLC, which pulls out the flailing tribes of, quote, savages, which is comedically undercut later on with the expansion leader, Hammerlock, proven for an ignorant slob, but it played around with fire anyway, and caught some blowback from critics. Orientalism isn't exactly racism, but they're closely related. Specifically, Orientalism involves casting one group of people as the other, usually an indigenous group of some kind, or some subject of colonialism. While the term originally referred to, quote, Western depictions of, quote, Eastern peoples, its usage has expanded in modern times to account for colonial perspectives in any hemisphere. And the reason this is a critical term is Orientalism as a perspective originates from the majority group in the dynamic. Famously, Heart of Darkness paints an absolutely inhuman caricature of certain African tribes, because the author was either ignorant about their lived lives or potentially overwilling to capture their differences from colonizers in the novel with a loose brush, and in portraying them in this reduced way, wrote a novel that ultimately supports the colonial narrative to an undiscerning reader, regardless of the intention, which was ultimately, presumably progressive. All because a person from a majority group, which historically wielded a monopoly of power over this smaller, othered group, decided to paint people in the other culture as impossible to understand inherently, which is wrong and harmful. Ignorance doesn't necessarily excuse itself. when ultimately used to spread this kind of harmful message. Mind you, this is the opinion of post-colonialist literary studies and critics like Chinua Achebe, who lambasted the novel. That perspective has in turn been criticized and rebuffed with additional perspective, but broadly from white authors seeking to control the narrative surrounding the work. Power, cultural dominance lies at the heart of this struggle. So, bear with me. There are two dominant strains of critique on this work in particular. The more traditional canon English lit analysis and Achebe's critique. Why this dichotomy is so hotly contested is the author is ultimately critiquing the colonialist perspective all the way back when it was written, which is stunningly progressive for the time. But to a more ignorant reader, to someone who doesn't understand how systemic oppression works and higher-minded concepts like that, the work can support a different narrative. And Achebe ultimately argues that it's not worth the price. Absolutely critical to this discussion is that people who feel harmed by the work are critical of the work, and people who could not possibly be harmed by the work defend it. Power dynamics are never a non-factor in these discussions. I say all this in anticipation of multiple essays in the comments supporting the traditional canon English lit reading, because that's what happens when you have these combos. So in case anyone wasn't willing to pick up on the subtext, I'm using this segment not to talk about the Weird West specifically, but to highlight how messy cultural discussions can get. Perspective matters. People matter. Because they have information we can't possibly have. They lived in entirely different ways. They're informed by completely different culturally underpinning information. And it's scary and ugly and uncertain. But that's the nature of art. It reflects the beholder. And any mindset that can't account for plurality, multiplicity, is not built for a connected, open-minded world. Many cases of Orientalism are lower key, less harmful misinformation that helps reinforce ignorance surrounding other groups and thereby rhetorically keeps them misunderstood. Hence the criticism. It doesn't have to be dramatic. Doing Orientalism isn't a crime worthy of execution. It only takes a simple acknowledgement, preferably a pledge to look a little deeper next time, to assuage most people. Most examples of Orientalism come from an era where we never would have thought about the damage written word can cause, or the power dynamics at play, because we're a thinking, changing, and growing civil society. The reason this concept of othering gets so thorny, aside from being actively critical of empire, is that plenty of reductive takes on othered cultures come from a place of genuine fascination, thirst for knowledge about the world. Sometimes it unintentionally leads to fetishization, blasé romanticizing, and that isn't evil, just misguided. But it can also speak to broader attitudes about people. I should be able to write about them without knowing them. I should be allowed to use their in-group iconography without understanding their cultural significance. I should be able to make assumptions. This is only fiction. And with massive reach via any particularly successful piece of media, it's easy to spread misinformation, and therefore bad cultural attitudes, to millions of people, a net social negative. This isn't to say you should portray people of varying ethnicities as the coolest people ever, but it's ultimately for the best to avoid reducing to caricature. You'd think this came out of the Wild West proper, with how cartoony it is. This video's taken a turn for the thorny. These kinds of academic debates aren't exactly settled, and for the most part exist in terms of teams. Turns out global thinkers have different motivations and principles, get annoyed by different things. It's also really important to dig into the Old West to actually understand it, elevate it beyond that blasé romanticizing and get ugly. Get in the thick of it, because American history is ugly, and that's just the truth. You never want to be the guy in the comments saying Orientalism isn't an issue. Other people's perspectives aren't an issue. That's a person trying to write one version of culture. That's a person who is ultimately a useful tool to empire. So what happens when a game is willing to be ugly? 2023's Blood West is about as ugly as it gets. Not because of the pixels. Oh no. Of the games collected here, none force the player to adapt or die faster than Blood West. It's a prickly experience from its aesthetics to its mechanics. Blood West wants you out, or rather, Blood West wants you to understand your place in its apocalyptic vision of the American frontier. The introductory cutscene paints the scenario clearly enough. An indigenous narrator correctly blames the downfall of the Wild West on the arrival and rapidly proliferating crimes of the white man. Greed, vanity, cruelty, murdering people on sacred ground all resulted in the Great Spirit abandoning the land. Now the dead are unable to pass to the great beyond, shambling on in death as wretched monstrosities. The player character is rescued, preserved in some way, with a ritual of some kind, and awakes, sentient. You rise without proper direction, but you're quickly roped into a series of tasks delivered by a spirit-inhabited skull that involve roaming the long cursed land, pistol in hand, and eradicating the very roots of evil that riddle the forlorn soil, blasting anything that moves, preferably with a bullet to the head, to strengthen yourself for future trials. Maybe the most fantastical thing about Blood West, above the twisted, wretched hell creatures that stalk the wastes, is imagining a world where people's bad actions have consequences. Instead of outright stating colonialism bad, a fair and accurate message, it uses the supernatural to abstract the message into the ludic experience. See all these zombies? See how dark and miserable? That's colonialism and how it affects the world. That's the direct result of colonialism. And they're absolutely right. Blood West stings in 100 ways. Basic combat can be incredibly challenging between keeping your dwindling ammo store stocked and actually surviving even low-level encounters. What the hell? I thought I was this guy. I thought I was a gunslinger. I've been taken for a fool. Most enemies will catch sight of the player at a distance and break into a full tilt, head-bobbing sprint. You do not have time to miss. If you fail to cleanly kill, generally with a well-placed shot between the eyes, you're going down in seconds. It's incredibly off-putting right away, but you learn quickly that Blood West is not the Old West and doesn't really care how much you want to be a legendary gunslinger, how much good boys should get auto-aim mechanics and bullet time, how much you think you deserve to be emblazoned as a historical hero for walking the plains with a six-shooter. You want it, you prove it. Seriously, you can unlock fanning the hammer, but only if you spec into gunslinging specifically. Otherwise, you're slinking in shadows, minding the little detection bar at the bottom, carefully balancing how much sound you make and predicting the movement path of any given enemy to farm up as much loot and experience as possible to eventually feel confident enough to walk freely. Stealth is core to the experience. It's actually the default kind of play because it's simply the most accessible. Aiming and shooting becomes significantly more viable later on as you gain confidence, better weapons, and hit points, but again, until then, until you've earned your legendary status with piles of experience, you'll be lurking in shadows, dagger in hand, playing the kind of person who's meant to be a key fixture in this experience, and being forced to creep in the darkness is a powerful message told in play. This isn't your America anymore, bucko. Blood West came from Hyperstrange, a relatively small studio, and was published by New Blood, the Dusk people. So it's unsurprising that it's a hardcore, lower-key, almost nostalgic experience. The crunchy, low-poly visuals, cast in deep shadow, managed to create fear on a budget. It's surprisingly effective at making the brain think twice about any given image, grotesquerie and context obfuscated, made hazy thanks to the lower fidelity presentation. Whole areas are drowned in darkness and resist hope by design. There is no light save for fire and magic, and you feel that dread. It can be hard to work up the courage to venture out and die time after time because the game world itself is uninviting, and the visuals are only part of the way the game creates challenge. Grit is quintessential to the Weird West. You are not the man with no name. You are not getting by on your own. Death is a common occurrence, and you quickly rack up soul wounds that degrade your abilities, make you worse at stealth, lower your base hit points if you're not playing extremely carefully. And this is important. Blood West wants the player to feel small and miserable in the barren blackness of its world. It wants you to know that you are not some old West legend and, in fact, just another ditch-feeding lowlife brought back from the abyss by the grace of powers that far outstrip you. Your soul is degrading because of your own unworthiness. And this is death spiral design. That is, repeat deaths only make it easier to die. You're forced to get on board or get out. Unlike many ImSim-type computer games, Blood West does not allow the player to fill their pockets with instant saves, something possible in even old games like Thief. There aren't any difficulty options. The challenge is deliberate. There are ways to remove soul wounds consistently and in some. The system isn't playthrough ruining. Even if it were, there's nothing stopping the player from pulling back and starting fresh when they feel ready. Death is expected, and you come to understand that fact pretty quickly. You work around the struggle, you push on regardless, you play on the game's terms. But it's a palpably demoralizing experience, and the reception to Blood West is exactly what you'd expect. People who pressed on through the challenges, lauding the game as a modern classic, and scores of players asking for a lower difficulty option, a revamped save system, players decrying the experience as entirely unfair, broken by design, and even loads of players looking for cheats, hacks, any way at all to roll credits. They like the game enough to want to stick around, but won't rise to the challenge, or can't. Normally, and even here, I see nothing inherently evil about accessibility options for people who want to casually poke around. I think fun is determined by the individual, people are more important than products, and it looks like a lot of people are moving on from Blood West. But I also have to praise the developers for sticking to their guns on the issue. This is not Red Dead Redemption. You simply are not allowed to play, in the game's own words, the stupid white man, running loose with your six-shooter and eventually immortalized in the history books. You're a dirtbag consequence of the American frontier, firmly rooted in the tradition of the Weird West, and you're going to have to grapple with that. That is, there is narrative value in preserving the identity of the play, not stripping it back. It's why people obsess over old Monster Hunter. It's why people love their quirky game nobody else really cares about, because it's kind of hard to engage with. I want to talk about Blood West's ending, so skip ahead if you think you're a bad enough dude to roll credits on Blood West. I've read a lot of angry posting about the ending, in YouTube videos and elsewhere, and I think it speaks to either a misunderstanding of the Weird West or a broader lack of context. It's a really simple ending. You finish off the final boss, and you remain an immortal slave of the spirits keeping you alive, and they imply that no matter what you do, you'll never be free, forever a revenant wandering a dead world that has no real hope of redemption. Bleak. The source of frustration seems to stem from players who pulled themselves through every last challenge, beat back every slavering beast, and live to tell the tale. Like I said, Blood West is a crushing game, and the raw triumph someone might feel for beating the final boss, immediately undercut by the ending cutscene, might create a sense that, well, what was it for, even? I rose to the challenge. I'm the good boy! The Weird West usually isn't this grim, but the pervasive reality of human smallness looms large in the genre. People are fleeting, trifling, and hopelessly outmatched most of the time because the forces that actually govern the world are supernatural, beyond human. And that's impossible to really meaningfully tangle with without also being supernatural. And even still, in the case of Blood West and others, you're still just one revenant. It's completely fitting given the context of the game, and more fittingly given what the problems in-game mean to a broader America. Blood West is not a story about shooting evil monsters. It's a direct critique of the awful behavior of colonizers entering a land they did not understand and immediately dooming it, and the world, in their arrogance. It's profoundly misanthropic in one sense, but also calls out the truth of the situation. Colonizers caused endless strife in the West, uprooting civilizations of Native Americans, introducing diseases and unsustainable behaviors. They hunted the bison to extinction. They cleared whole forests. They industrialized and polluted and ruined, and all in the name of short-term profit for whoever had the capital to fund those ventures. And the protagonist was just another cog in that bigger picture, a nameless dirtbag bandit. I like that he's doomed to serve a greater power in Undead, if only as a sort of symbolic retribution for what happened to the land. It's understood that on a personal level, maybe as far as we know, he doesn't deserve that kind of fate, but in endings like this, we have to look at the bigger picture and recontextualize his role and the scenario in the lineage of American history. The Plains, the West, did not deserve its Americaning. Blood West is a smaller scale project than some of these, and it's received updates and patches like you'd expect. But the most interesting addition is their surprise add-on material, Dead Man's Promise.
This world is turning into a living hell. No place to raise a little girl.
So if you were worried about the game not being relatable, that's solved. It's not a ton more game, only accounting for the length of one additional chapter, maybe 3 to 4 hours played competently, but the value isn't as much in the product and more in the premise. Dead Man's Promise shifts the player character away from the undead drifter of the main game and puts them in the shoes of a shaman, prowling the swamp in the name of the god of death, ultimately for the benefit of his daughter. Though the DLC is challenging and intended for people who actually pulled through the main game, it does something I really appreciate by effectively resisting or casting off the Old West to an extent. Yes, you can find a quality revolver or a shotgun and blow holes in anything you see, exactly like before, but now there's an alternate form of currency racked up over the course of play that lets you trade with this woman alone. You can use that currency to buy magical artifacts, shaman tools as it were, and when used effectively, they're easily stronger and more useful than regular guns. I have to highlight the voodoo doll, which will drain your health if you repeatedly miss your targets, punishing you for incorrect use of the tool, but also has no ammo, meaning you have an endless supply of damage, an infinite headshot machine that entirely removes the innate brutality of having to scrounge for ammo, all locked behind the player's ability to use it correctly. The original protag never had such an option, you had to scrape to jam lead into your precious murder device, but not the doll, or the staff. This is myth-making by way of mechanics, okay? Lionizing the cultural worth of voodoo and making the protagonist a legitimate Wild West gunslinger counterpart, elevating the Haitian Ungan as a worthy Western archetype. Or at least it's trying. Voodoo dolls, the ones that you stab, to harm someone in revenge, that trope is also othering. Orientalism, misinformation that isn't accurate to the effigy's place in Haitian voodoo. But at the very least, in Blood West, it's used explicitly to expel monstrous demons from the land instead of harming innocents. The DLC at least partially taps into the signs and signifiers of Haitian voodoo, an oft-ignored facet of Southern spirituality. Voodoo developed in Haiti and spread in the US during roughly the same period as the American frontier, between the 16th and 19th centuries, as the product of syncretism, combining traditional African faiths and Roman Catholicism passed down by colonial Frenchmen. Voodoo is historically the result of colonialism, but that doesn't make it lesser by design. The mythical frameworks that people uphold have personal importance and in cases like this represent community solidarity and strength in the face of oppression, making meaning of what you know and what you have. The fact that voodoo is so often absent from depictions of the West is entirely predictable and the inevitable result of creating a palpably ethnocentric genre of fiction around historical fact. It is an unalloyed good to represent other people who've been left out and make them cool, just as cool as any gunslinger, in the fiction. But since Dead Man's Promise is so challenging, in a base game that can be excruciating, it's almost poetically out of reach, left only for the interested few to unravel. The Weird West is a double-edged sword. To replicate the West convincingly demands attention to detail, and in games, from video to tabletop, further demands some layer of craft, frictive design. No matter how cool Fanning the Hammer looks, revolvers themselves are fiddly and weird. This is not a sleek, smooth genre, and its guns match the energy. How that texture is manifested by designers and developers is integral to the experience. You can make a really easy Weird West game, or easy enough, as long as it's sufficiently weird. Most of them aren't, like Blood West, and it's entirely by design. One of the problems you run into when you get really nerdy and overtuned and reflective about video games is that baseline reviews kind of become unwatchable. I watched videos proclaiming that Blood West just doesn't have enough hours in it to be worth your time, and Weird West for the PCs, it's like not that deep, so it's like a 7 out of 10, and you just sit there. Is anyone reflecting on what they play, or are they just playing it? I think that's kind of like life, though. Is anyone actually reflecting on life, or are they just living it? The centerpiece of this video is Wolfeye Studios' 2022 game, simply titled Weird West. Directed by once president of Arcane Studios, Rafael Colantonio, Weird West is the single most expressive version of the subgenre in this particular medium, and actively in conversation with its roots. Just look at the bold presentation, the stark, smoldering yellow, brown, and red. It's evoking the comic book origin of the Weird West in these striking silhouettes and limited palette. and Ben-Day dots straight out of the old era comic books. The flat, cel-shaded aesthetic stamps these characters firmly in the world, and even approaching the edge of any given map makes it plain. This abstract universe exists on the page, smatterings of a history told in moments. It's such a powerful expression of not only the Weird West, but the American frontier as well for these reasons. It's a confluence of culture, a repository of tradition, and still manages to do something completely bizarre, interesting, and unexpected. The core conceit of Weird West is simple. The player steps into the shoes of 5 different characters over the course of a full run, encountering scores of people, friendly or otherwise, solving problems and uprooting evil, for an ultimate purpose that's hidden from the player until the ending. You're drip-fed hints in the form of cryptic kids, wanderers, and out-of-context cutscenes depicting some kind of audience commenting on your progress. It's very much keyed into its director's roots, tapping into the same creative ethos that saw the ominous outsider watch over the player's actions in Dishonored without offering any real guidance. Like Dishonored, you're free to handle encounters however you like. You can stealthily creep through the game or paint the walls with your 12 gauge, and I've always appreciated that kind of play framework. A critic might call it fundamentally unfocused, but I think role-playing games should allow players to express themselves and the vision they have for the characters they play mechanically. Every character you play is a different person, someone with a lived life in-universe, with motivations and context, and you're free to act on that context or write your own future. Of every title collected here, no other game so thoroughly immerses the player in the tradition of the Weird West, because the play is effectively built on the design considerations underpinning Dishonored, a game I really love a normal amount for offering so many varied approaches to level completion. Weird West allows players to become any kind of person without reward or consequence, without judgment, not meaningfully, and that speaks volumes in itself. You can shred whole populations or act within the exact constraints of the law. You can carve a bloody path or follow the way of the open palm or the butt end of your shotgun anyway. You can take a diplomatic approach at times and even undermine other people in stealthy, surreptitious ways. Not that there's anything wrong with slang and hot iron. Weird West acknowledges the tumult characteristic of the period, throws you straight in, and lets you figure things out as you go. You didn't want to be a criminal, but you killed someone accidentally. You get to live with that guilt. Shot people without fear of consequence and suffered exclusion. Got hunted by bounty hunters? You earned that. For how small and diorama-esque it appears, Weird West is the most full-blooded experience on the table, even among regular video game westerns. That is, if you want a hand in shaping the game. Red Dead Redemption, I mean. It's like a lot of writing, and it's a framework that understands its source material. Fistful of Dollars sees the man with no name do everything but get directly, violently involved until things boil over by the end. Weird Westerns are characterized by the incredible odds facing the protagonist, except now we're in a video game. Sometimes you see an enemy that strictly outranks you in terms of numerical level. The odds are laid out plain. You don't have much of a chance fighting this encounter head-on. So what do? You can solve the problem in a number of ways involving other characters, or, with enough skill, carefully pick them apart in a firefight that might take a couple of redos. Front-load your special abilities, blow your cooldowns, kite them around the town. Whatever happens, you earned it. You memorialized yourself through another character in the Old West. It's the characters that immediately draw me to Weird West. Just look at the cover. Yeah, that's a gunslinger, but that is absolutely not a square-jawed, bearded crackshot. That's a middle-aged woman of dubious ancestry. You might have been sold on Weird West's 5 playable characters premise, but you're actually made to unlock them by playing through each character's story in sequence. You break into the game in a controlled order. Leading with this character is brilliant. She's clearly keyed into the Wild West framework. A seasoned shooter. She's got 2 guns. But loading in, you find she's an older woman who hung up those guns until trouble rolls in and she's made to sort it out the hard way. Weird West reacts to the Wild West by feeding you a fairly typical cow person revenge story that eventually unravels by the end of her path, and you're immediately put into the role of a pigman. Yeah, you saw the title. Don't act surprised, they're not actually anthropomorphic pigmen, but regular people chopped up brains and souls transplanted into stitched-up bodies formed of pig and human flesh, cursed with this obscene visage by someone punishing them for their actions as regular men. Unfortunately, our character has amnesia, so we're sent on a quest to piece his past together, figure out why someone would do this. But the interesting thing is the change in world dynamics. Before, Jane was accepted basically anywhere as just another person, and so shopping wasn't a hassle. People trusted you, and you felt like you belonged in some way to this weird vision of the Old West, with the many connections Jane had and the friends she made. Did I mention you can make friends, even with previous party members, and get them to join up with you like it's a proper posse? I barely did it because I will play the man with no friends, but you don't have to be lonely out there. The pigmen have no such luxury, though, and you're treated like a monster in regular towns, or at least until you've proven yourself trustworthy with your deeds. Suddenly, you're relying a lot more on stealth mechanics, actually sneaking around populated areas to pass by unscathed, because people do treat you as cursed, as lesser, because of your appearance. It's not entirely unjustified. Pigmen can't speak English, they mostly grunt. And most pigmen will attack humans on sight, eat just about anything. Humans. They'll collect human tongues. For all intents and purposes, pigmen are monsters in this setting, even if they've simply gone mad or lost themselves to their utter inability to integrate with human society. It's a stark change in pace. Stealth isn't uncommon in the game. It's like the bedrock of play when you're not certain you can win against impossible odds. But the world is colder, lonelier, hopeless. So you're given something recognizable, something painful, and then you're allowed to play as a native warrior. Something Weird West doesn't get enough credit for is forcing perspective. It captures so many facets of its own universe by changing the player character. It does not care if you want the werewolf guy. Oh no, chances are you won't even unlock lycanthropy in a normal playthrough because it's gated behind highly specific, universe-dependent actions. So the cards were dealt and you get to play the hand you got. You're swept into stories you may not have picked, may never have seen, if the game let you play around entirely at your own discretion. Instead, it's crafting a narrative. Now we're in the heart of the West itself, integrating with facsimiles of real indigenous groups, actually getting their perspective beyond like cowboys and Indians, beyond the archetypes. So much of the way history paints the West does so in terms of teams. The frontiersmen, the lawmen, the Indians. Like that isn't an entirely enormous and diverse group of people, not a monolith. Being put on any given team without player input kind of rules. It means everyone is your team. It's a profoundly human message and elevates every playable character for that reason alone. You might not want to play the big weird pigman, but you will come to enjoy the big weird pigman. You don't come across the same kinds of discrimination as the pigmen, playing as the native fighter, hopefully for obvious reasons, but you're still made to tangle with your place in the West, how you're viewed by others who can't possibly understand your intentions and motivations, people who have no respect for your customs or interests, and it's grating. Now, in this person's shoes, it's so easy to understand how frustrating it is to be dismissed without a second thought, considered lesser or ignorant by birth, having your concerns, interests, and perspective ignored by a broader culture. Afterwards, you're thrust into characters more connected to the fiction and, in fact, the central conflict of Weird West. These are the bounty hunter and the onirist, both members of opposing religious factions, one from the dominant religious group and the other from its secretive opposer. It's worth mentioning that Weird West takes place in a sort of alt history, closer to alternate universe version of the Old West. Somehow we've gotten far enough along the march of human civilization to arrive at the American frontier, cowboys, Indians, and all, but with an entirely separate version of dominant spirituality. This is important because Christianity was the spiritual backbone of white America. Christian iconography dominates depictions of the Wild West. Churches, preachers, nuns, crosses, all of these things now need to be altered, and the socio-historical context of these symbols has to be changed or forgotten. The dominant religion is absolutionism, a faith brought to the West by settlers from the Old Home, as it's called, presumably the game's alt-history version of any number of European countries. We ate borscht back in old country, etc., etc. Absolutionists worship the twin deities Yeb and Inun. One represents peace and prosperity, while the other represents the harvest, change, and death. The faith is functionally about the cycle of life and death, and it's the conviction of the flock that to disrupt the cycle is to threaten the world. It's a faith that ultimately supports and reaffirms the status quo, takes strength in your inability to control the world around you. The cycle is a force beyond your puny comprehension, and tampering with it is to tamper with what you cannot understand, which sounds strikingly similar to modern-day rhetoric surrounding certain topics. I like this fictional faith standing in place for Christianity, specifically because the typical reaction to criticism of colonialism from people who haven't really given it much thought, usually politically illiterate North American white people, is to declare, that's just how things are, get over it. It happened a long time ago, nobody cares now, we can't do anything. North America writ large has a problem with complacency, supported by a crushing economic framework and fairly tight socioeconomic conditions, especially in America. And really, voter turnout is the easiest way to illustrate this. Absolutionism is directly opposed by a secretive order of witches, the Onirists. For Dune fans, they're not completely dissimilar to the Bene Gesserit, being an all-female order that seeks to guide humanity towards some ultimate purpose. Only here, they've started actively murdering whole flocks of absolutionists, which prompts the absolutionists to find some means of transforming their own soldiers into werewolves, to beat them all down, to kill them all, because it wouldn't be the Weird West without pulp. This alt-universe version of the American frontier is helpful for buying people into the fiction to an extent. Some people get incredibly cagey about portrayals of real faith in video games, especially violent video games, but the fiction is not as toothless as you might think. The Lost Fire Nation, a native tribe that factors heavily into the plot, mimics the real-world Anishinaabe, a collection of culturally related indigenous peoples largely occupying the Great Lakes region of current-day Canada and the United States. Those living in U.S. territory were subjected to the Indian Removal Act, which was one of many forced displacements of native peoples across the United States. In-game, the Lost Fire Nation will sometimes cite their own in-universe displacement by Jaganashag, the Anishinaabe word for colonizer, which happens to be synonymous with Englishman. This is all to say that Weird West may sand off some of its edges, but if you're willing to look at what the authors are actually saying, the game is a scathing critique of the historical mistreatment of indigenous populations, inhumane behavior of all kinds, religious dogma, and the pervasive greed underpinning the American frontier. Also exploding kegs like totally owned, man. I have to take a minute to talk about the ending because it's crucial to the video. Because I know there's someone sneering, thinking, so this game just hates me for being white, or for being an American. Not true. Technically, the game has two endings that depend on choices made, but as far as I'm concerned, there's really only one. That is, if you actually engaged with the game in any meaningful way. The final cutscene of Weird West reveals that the player is actually an incredibly powerful being from a group of immortal once-humans who've grown so old and tired with life, with the world, with humanity, that they see no reason to carry on and seek an immediate end. These are people who extended their lifespans with wishes, and even in attaining ultimate freedom from mortality, the greatest possible riches, lost all will to live regardless. So Aleph, the player, decided to try something before agreeing to termination. He would transplant his soul into other beings to see if he could feel anything, become human again. In the end, the player is interrogated and can speak emotionally or neutrally in response to various questions. If you answer neutrally to every question, the world is destroyed. You failed to become mortal. You failed to connect. If you answer with emotion, which isn't hard when you're suddenly shoved into a chair and forced to answer for your in-game actions, you become mortal. All of the immortals become mortal. The world is saved. The ending is simplistic, but it means everything, black and white as it seems, because it's the game's thesis statement. The world is vast, ugly, full of disparate, confused people all trying to pull through and acted on by forces far beyond their immediate control. You step into the lived lives of 5 separate people from 5 separate groups, all completely different facets of existence in this fictional take on the Old West, all mechanically as worthy as the others, and you're made to care. You roleplay as these characters, you come to know them and their struggles, their relationships, you empathize with them. By the end of the game, you've played as 5 unique people and opened your eyes to pain and discrimination you might never have access to, especially in most video games. You didn't watch something or read it, you navigated it yourself. You've been the colonizer, the murderer, the hero, and you think that all of these things were worth fighting for. Weird West's ending is the real American dream made manifest, and maybe it's a touch saccharine, but not really. The West rolls on just as shitty as before, just as full of cruelty and awfulness and misery as before, but the game still firmly sides with life, with struggle, with overcoming adversity, and I think that's a much more personally relevant message to most people than any call to the void, especially when accepting the status quo and becoming complacent is the game's ultimate target of criticism. I also like Weird West because, frankly, the weird in the Weird West is at a premium. Usually it's just werewolves, vampires, zombies, and other stuff, like recognizable tropes. But I have to stop myself and remember that for some people, anything even kind of out of left field is high weird. Some Weird West games toe the line. Evil West is a 2022 action game from Flying Wild Hog. There's a surprising amount of European penetration in Old West video games, which makes sense. The Western is internationally influential, and it's worth remembering that the West in sum is an international enterprise. The United States was quite literally patchworked together by immigrants fleeing strife in their own countries or leaving for opportunity. People love to forget the importance of Chinese immigrants in constructing railroads. The establishing Western, The Great Train Robbery, is inspired partly by the earlier British film Kidnapping by Indians, and even in the 60s, Fistful of Dollars not only came out of Italians, but it's directly inspired by Yojimbo, enough that it caused an international lawsuit. America did not rise wholly original from the land it sits on, and neither did its most identifiable genre. Evil West is more obviously tropey than some of the games I'm featuring. It's very much born of the pulp origins of the Weird West, and doesn't do a lot of specific work to interrogate the broader Western concept, but hey man, I've got a really big gun. Electric brass knuckles and a flamethrower, and dynamite, a crossbow, and the ability to rapidly pummel zombies until they explode, and the ability to supercharge my entire self with electricity and dash around the room like a Super Saiyan. Evil West is a modern 360-era, arguably PS2-era action game. You move through a series of stages, occasionally platforming and collecting money to power yourself up, and wander into cordoned-off kill rooms when it's time for the game to game. I'm gaming really, really hard right now. Evil West is not for everyone. It's not really bad at anything in particular, and only really good at being itself. It gives you sweeping vistas and rugged, beautiful terrain that slowly gives way to magic as the impending doom approaches, and does some genuinely inspired things with the setting, including the villains employing fat, wriggling leeches to drain life from the land. At some points, it feels something like Indiana Jones. Tomb delving, rope swinging, puzzle solving, it's a neat pastiche of the many edge-hovering influences that make up the Weird West. The combat manages to fit the exact vibe Blood West does, in a completely different way. In that game, you're scared. You're gonna die. One guy is too much all of the time. Here, you're battering down swarms of enemies, but they're so numerous, and so varied, and so specific that combat turns into something like juggling or spinning plates. You always have to prioritize targets in a certain way, accessing certain tools to manage them, and it's daunting. Surprisingly challenging in a genre where it's easy to assume you'll be competent because, you've played Ninja Gaiden on normal mode and know Flying Swallow breaks most weak enemies, or how in Bayonetta you can land witch time and go crazy. Here, you're a monster hunter and you've got every tool for the job. That said, there is an upper limit to bop it. Combat is completely littered with options. So many you'll be wondering which button does what every time you pick up the controller. It's an experience you need to break in like quality leather, and it pays off. By the end, you'll feel so confident in juggling your myriad combat options, you'll feel like you've actually lived up to the protagonist's illustrious namesake. Jesse Rentier is a no-good gunslinging son of a gun, and his dad is effectively the most important person in the battle against the forces of darkness, which is mostly vampires in this version of United States history, but you'll be fighting plenty of other creatures too. Rentier is a legendary name in universe, even though it's French, which is honestly pretty weird for the US, and shoot if it's not a hard name to live up to. Evil West is about as crunchy for a Western action game as it gets, and that means it understands exactly where it sprouts from. The Weird West doesn't just call to any old player, okay? Survivor types only. Roll your own quarterlies or make tracks, partner. A surprisingly large amount of in-game time is devoted to cutscenes. Despite all of its B-game trappings, Evil West does intricate, opulent work in making its cast spring to life on the screen, even if most of them only really live on that withering stage and don't enter play proper. And the story is really easy to reduce down to a pithy summary. The Rentier Institute, funded by the United States government, has finally developed the technology necessary to hunt vampire kind down and exterminate them to protect humanity. It's a yeehaw, tick, steak, and adventure through the heartland. Vampires are locked in this conflict with humankind for obvious reasons. They need blood to survive, and so their very existence is dangerous to mortal beings. But the vampires are few, at least compared to the totality of humanity, and so they're forced to hide themselves away behind illusion magic, glamours that obfuscate their hiding places and which the newly forged Rentier Gauntlet is able to dispel. One high-ranking vampire proposed taking the fight to humanity first, before human technology could advance to such a point where humanity held all the cards, as it were. But the vampires resisted him and even punished him for the suggestion, and now the vampires are on the back foot, being hunted relentlessly to extinction by Jesse goddamn Rentier, and forced to go on the offensive regardless. It's actually a somewhat sympathetic narrative read past the veneer. What other options do the vampires have? Yes, they'll be cruel, and disgusting, and awful, but they're embroiled in a war for their survival, and that means not pulling punches, weaponizing fear, hitting where it hurts. It's an intractable conflict that's made to play out over the course of the game, no differently than how history was left to pan out as it did in the real Old West. All of those conflicts, all of that misery, abstracted to a more easily understood, fantastical space. It's ultimately not interrogated as meaningfully as I'd like, but then, how much historical conflict ever is? Vampires make for great opposition, though, and I hope it's clear why mythical creatures can still make for meaningful villains. So often in conflict, the opposing side is dehumanized, even demonized, their wants and needs and motivations not considered or considered irrelevant. That's just a fundamental truth of war. The game ends with the vampires remaining, and for all anyone knows, the developers might bake additional context into them and actually pick up with that premise. You know, if life and unique persons are so important, surely there's some way to bridge the gap beyond total extermination. While Evil West doesn't speak to me as strongly as several of the games listed here, I appreciate one aspect of its story above all else. When the world falls apart, when the head of the Rentier Institute, Jesse's father, becomes unreliable, when people can no longer put their faith in this powerful group of monster hunters, these legends of the West, the remnants of the institution, Jesse, the quirky inventor Virgil, the headstrong, no-nonsense Amelia, and Jesse's best friend Edgar, team up and succeed against the encroaching evil anyway. They aren't all equally useful. They each contribute differently, and personal sacrifices are made for the good of the defenseless, but the world is saved because of their cooperation. I hammer on about saccharine stuff like this a lot, in RPGs mostly, but it's so crucial to the American founding myth by design, you know. So much of the reality that built the American frontier is totally obfuscated, enough that something as plain and hokey as the gang all joined up and beat back the villains feels more honest than it has any right to. It isn't making out Virgil and Amelia as superheroes, just demonstrating that they have unique worth and value as people. These things happen in our fiction at least, from time to time, but can't displace the overwhelming supermajority of white masculinity in the Old West. Even here, Jesse's still at the helm, but at the very least it's nodding in acknowledgement. And that's all good for story, but the gameplay is not also working with the plot to sell this narrative. You don't control these characters. In fact, you don't really do anything at all with them. They just exist on the stage. And in the video game medium, the ultimate opportunity to sell story with play, it's a bit of a missed opportunity. You know the Western is good when it goes for grit. Hard West is a hard sell for a lot of people who play games. You find that the broadest possible audience mostly wants something action-y, something kinda easy, and something that vaguely feels good, which roughly translates to letting developers pulverize your dopamine receptors, which runs entirely counter to the aesthetics of this subgenre. The Weird West is gritty and dark and not always fun to work through. Even in dire circumstances, it's supposed to be a slow burn. Something apparent in the original production of Deadlands. Part of the joy of the genre is the heart, the cruft, the detail. And to meaningfully immerse oneself in that paradigm almost always demands players slow down, meander on through the pastures. Even Red Dead Redemption 2 did this. 2-hour intro? Jeez. In a medium where one too many game overs carries increasing chances a player will never start a given game back up, taking the time to stop and appreciate and humble themselves to the level of the learner is a losing bet. Hard West is a mean game. It's you, just another mediocre settler and your dad, against a world that won't glance twice if you keel over or disappear. The world is barren, with only a few points of interest that open up as you play, text boxes and mountains of dust. If you're looking for instant action, this is hell. It's incredibly exciting from the OG Deadlands appreciator perspective, though. You can see how the team leveraged a relatively low budget to do something true to the origins of the Weird West. You're left to your own devices and forced to survive in this harsh wasteland. The sun's hot, food's low, money's low, morale's low. You read through the terse descriptions of a land living payday to payday and generally one behind. It forces you to read, gets you invested in the story, so by the time you found every way to make money, taken all the gambles you could, and lost again and again, it feels completely crushing when you're forced into combat with invading bandits ready to kill you dead, pick you clean, and squat on your homestead. The protagonist's life crumbles over the course of the first hour or so, losing his father, losing his bride-to-be, and eventually losing his life, brought back as a revenant with a thirst for vengeance. Hard West is called what it is for a darn good reason. It takes place in the West. It also follows cues from both the Western and Weird West films. It's a revenge story, but the player is ultimately entangled with forces far beyond his limited power. But while I like Hard West and its approach to this subgenre, I want to highlight its sequel here most. Because while Hard West 1 does similar things to its eventual sequel, Hard West 2 really takes it to the hoop. Sequels don't always inspire confidence, especially sequels handled by separate studios, but Hard West 2 keys into some very specific traits of the modern Weird West to sell the experience, traits that are now critical to the subgenre's identity. You start the game as a posse, a white gunslinger, another white gunslinger, a native bruiser, and a witch of some kind. You find yourself attempting a heist, and instead fighting for your life through the cars of a spider-legged, supernatural train, and after a brief altercation, end up stranded in the frozen wastes in deep winter. Your shadows are missing, and while it's easy to laugh off in the moment, you don't quite know what the train's conductor, the demon Mammon, did to you, so you set out on a journey through the harsh winter mountains to recover whatever you lost. Hard West 2 isn't as grim as the original. The winter is narratively brutal, but you're under no real mechanical pressure to survive. You simply move from place to place, putting a posse together, working together, and hunting down an ex-posse member who betrayed you. It's slightly more user-friendly than the original. You still want to poke your head wherever you can for upgrades and items, anything you can rustle up to stack the odds in your favor, but it's also less willing to immediately punish the player for role-playing. Instead of only negatives on a bad call, you might get one thing and lose another. The game is draped in a palpably Weird West aesthetic, more so than the original game, with disturbing sights and supernatural occurrences around nearly every corner. The key distinction, though, is its particular expression of the supernatural. In the original, the player was quite literally pitted against death and the devil. Here, you'll meet the spirit of a forest, encounter multiple kinds of supernatural being, some malevolent and others not, which is crucial. Older versions of Weird West settings, even Hard West 1, are still slavishly devoted to the aesthetics of the subgenre's forebear. You face off with the devil, or death, because they're the ultimate possible villains of the frontier legend, something profoundly perverse, the opposite of morality, and the eventual end of your story. They resist your ability to spin yourself into myth in-game. The American Western imagines a convenient world where the good guys and the people on their team shoot the best and functionally are the best, and everything else is a hazard or an enemy to be destroyed. It's only a matter of course that the hero achieves historical status and fame, tall tales and novelizations, because it was theirs for the taking. They only had to show up and shoot good. Hard West 2 incorporates a lot of depictions of indigenous peoples in a way that at least seems intentionally mindful of their representation. I don't get to decide that, ultimately, but the attempt is obvious. It's willing to grapple with other versions of the supernatural, not just European and Christian versions, and refuses to cast it as universally evil or villainous. Where once stood a subgenre stuffed with zombies and vampires, killer mosquitoes, the devil stands in its place a game with an empathetic look at other perceptions of the world and its phenomena. Hard West 2 attempts, in some small way, to decolonize the Western. And yes, acknowledge, you still play as the familiar white gunslinger character, sure, but critically, you lose one of the two you start with. In fact, you're pitted against him and join forces with the aforementioned witch, a woman. Your pal Laughing Deer, an actual dead man walking, so something profoundly heretical by design, a native bow fighter who knows the local terrain well, and a man of faith, also of African ancestry. But it isn't the relatively diverse cast of characters alone that makes Hard West 2 an active interrogation of the American frontier and the historical Weird West. It's the gameplay. Tactics games like this require players to utilize all of their options to survive. This game gives every character a unique ability, often a unique weapon as well, which reflavors the ludic reality, the mechanical reality of every character in your posse. You learn who's good at what. You find that some are incredibly powerful if used in just the right way. The witch can teleport at critical moments, swapping positions with another enemy, rendering them easily slain. Laughing Deer can brutalize a sequence of enemies that you've prepped for the slaughter by chaining melee strikes. You find that some characters, who aren't always useful, given a little play context, entirely shift the balance of battle in your favor. You realize the inherent worth of these unique individuals through play. This is not new to video games. Plenty of tactical games and RPGs, even things as narratively unambitious as League of Legends, understand this concept, but here, in this specific subgenre which exists in conversation with the Old West, it's critical context. Most Western material is flatly unconcerned with people who actually populated the American frontier. If indigenous tribes appear, they're treated historically as noble savages or barbarians with little room for nuance. Oftentimes, Chinese immigrants are completely absent, despite the importance of Chinese labor physically laying the foundation for the trains we picture so romantically. The American frontier was always a multinational, imperial project, but we don't honor or acknowledge that fact, and in many cases try to bury the reality. What's really incredible is the fireside chat system. It's a small thing, right? Setting up camp for the night and sitting around an open flame, but you're given the chance to talk to party members individually. You listen to them, you respond, you try to help them with their problems, and in doing so, you earn their trust, and they become more useful in battle. Once again, tying mechanical power to the bonds you build. Hard West 2 slipped under a lot of people's radars and sailed on into obscurity, and these systems alone make it worthy of a second look. But bigger than that, Hard West 2 is at the very forefront of the conversation in shaping the Weird West as a subgenre, one that's meaningfully in tune with American history sheerly through its ability to recognize that other perspectives exist. It's a little bit depressing to me that for some of these games, the weird is not necessarily the supernatural or the evil, but rather the fact that other people are there who never got a fair shot at telling their stories. South of Midnight released on April 3rd, 2025. It's a charming, heartfelt vision of the American South woven with incredible attention to detail and tangible love. It also takes place in decidedly modern times, so why is it featured here? South of Midnight was sold as a modern-era Southern Gothic, which is distinct but spiritually linked to the Weird West by design. I just happen to think South of Midnight shares the same, or greater cultural relevance to this particular discussion as the other games featured in this video, and hammers home a lot of the same ideas, regardless of minor subgenre distinction. It's hard to pin down a precise dividing line between the Weird West and the Southern Gothic, except that the latter is primarily concerned with the Deep South. But I've read one description that attributes the fear from the Weird West originating from raw, primal human nature and manifesting in obvious ways, where in Southern Gothics, the rot's coming from within the house, as it were. And I think that description captures some of what South of Midnight does, in that much of the conflict is actually internal. Maybe presenting as external for a while, you definitely slap a lot of monsters with your little sticks, but it becomes obvious that personal failings underwrite the bulk of the on-screen strife and manifest physically. The rot is coming from within. It was sold as an empathetic game about healing, and that's what you do.
I know.
What'd you say?
I said, and pack 'em light.
Pack a bag, then pack it light. Hey, pack your bags, then pack 'em light.
Why do I get the feeling that this pissed somebody off? Hazel Flood finds herself swept up in a journey through the rural American South, bayou country, to find her mother. While she's helped along by various people, she remains fiercely independent as friends come and go. Nobody else is ever on her exact wavelength, so she mostly does it alone. which is actually core to the game. The big plot kickoff moment happens after the flood sweeps her mother downstream, a person she wasn't able to fully see or understand, and that happens with multiple characters over the course of the game because, as people, our first point of connectivity with others is assumption. After all, each of us is the main character of the universe, and so we confabulate, we approximate, we categorize people and put them into boxes to neatly understand them, but that's a limited perspective and an unhelpful way to recognize the unique humanity of any given person. Which is of course why YouTube comments, taking a quick glance at the game, are littered with this. You ever wonder if people get tired of forcing, exhausting discourse? Hazel gains the ability to see the negative energy instilled in the land by human pain, called stigma here, and learns how to unravel those knotted energies to heal the countryside and its people. You'd think, with a word like stigma being used to denote emotional pain physically harming the land, that this would be a significantly more heavy-handed game focused primarily on race relations in the Deep South, and from what I've gathered from disparate reactions to trailers, people were afraid of that, but it really isn't. Not that there would be anything wrong with that version of the game, because for some people, subtext never lands. Instead, it's a game about traveling the rural South, encountering different lived lives, and helping them heal. The pain is with the populace. I think that premise works well in a video game. Many game enjoyers expect action at a baseline, and physically hauling wreckage and sorting out damage wouldn't constitute an exciting enough story, maybe. Gamified. For some anyway, so tie healing directly to action. Tell a story where taking the reins on a situation is the only way to actually work through it. Work through those knots with your hooked stick things and big old boot. It's a hokey kind of play abstraction, but exactly what games are good at. This is the genre where you pick up your sword and team up with your friends and kill the strongest person alive who's representative of the status quo.
It's still alive in the background. Yes! Yes, this is so good!
It's also designed to a mass market kind of audience. So yes, you will platform like it's Uncharted or Infamous. You will power up using a skill tree, and you absolutely will roll into a series of repetitive kill rooms and abuse the almighty dodge button that you can upgrade into a double dodge, by the way, slapping down hit after hit on scores of enemies you've killed 50 times before to reach the end of the game. If that doesn't sound frustrating or you're not really overtuned about video games, congratulations on your freedom. In case it isn't obvious, I think South of Midnight is more culturally and aesthetically significant to the medium and to the Weird West than its play might instantly suggest. In case you're personally worried about it, accessibility options let you tweak the experience to your liking. Stylistic choices can't be ignored. In the vein of Little Goody Two-Shoes, a lot of the game is deliberately designed to invoke a handcrafted sensibility. From the painted wood visuals to the stop-motion intro cutscene, the folktale delivery of chapter transitions, South of Midnight is gorgeous. A completely indulgent visual parade of a breed you don't often encounter, and especially fitting in this lineage, only spun for the Deep South. They even attempted to replicate the stop-motion feel of that intro cutscene in regular gameplay, something I turned off because, frankly, it's an action game and they're typically at their best operating at a smooth 60, so the combat is more readable. If anything, it has the consequence of making you think you're dropping frames, like you've cranked the settings too high and your computer can't handle it. So I toggled that feature off. In fact, I toggled a lot of the HUD off at a point because I'm pretty used to these kinds of action games. But more importantly, South of Midnight is stunning. Every turn a sweeping vista, every bend a natural garden. You're left to run through the incredibly faithful countryside, digging in tucked away spots for additional upgrade power, so you're incentivized to actually get out and touch grass. Not that you need motivation. It's an almost saccharine kind of devastation. After the rain, something grows. I don't live in the South, but I do live outside any kind of metropolis by a good few hours. South of Midnight reads as instantly faithful to its rural inspiration, capturing so many quirky facets of a world removed from the noise and glitz of the city, but somehow still collecting whatever blows in. Posters, advertisements, man-made megaliths, and signs of civilization dot a land in tatters. Woods give way to swamps, which carry on into muddy farmland. The only thing that would have made it more authentic would be mosquitoes and black flies. But South of Midnight is also tapped into the echoes of the Weird West. Aside from the cutesier elements like Crouton, Hazel's now sentient stuffed toy, you also cross paths with a number of supernatural characters and phenomena pulled straight out of the oral tradition of Southern American storytelling, and almost always accompanied by other regular people, just like you, who fell into the supernatural on accident. While Catfish here isn't a strictly told tale in Cajun folklore, they're plentiful in the South and subject to tall tales about their size, but it goes deeper than this one character. Haints of all kinds and sizes. The alligator two-toed Tom, the Rougarou, a little far from its original werewolf form. The Honey Island swamp monster, simply called Honey here, and Hug and Molly are all tales pulled from the South. Not inventions of the game, but strands spun up so opulently and convincingly you'd think they were. How often does local folklore break into video games? How many examples of Greek and Norse mythology color gaming writ large? By comparison, it's a game that puts the South first. Echoes of the Old West linger on in the now confident preacher, who seized her autonomy and personhood by disposing of her abusive father with the help of his own pet alligator. A brutal story, but decidedly weird and decidedly Western. When the walls are closing in, sometimes you have to take action to save yourself. Hug and Molly is a real folk tale about a woman who terrorizes children. But here she's represented sympathetically, ultimately a victim of assumptions made about her appearance and tall tales about her actions. She's creepy. She's incapable of speech. She's genuinely unnerving, but she also plucks people out of bad situations and heals them, provides for them, and it's something that Hazel is made to grapple with because she initially falls prey to the same assumptions as everyone else, only learning the truth too late. Laurent, the Rougarou, and someone once involved in Hazel's life, left their home years ago, vanished into thin air, but it's revealed that it wasn't motivated by some moral failing, but rather his propensity to transform into a monster when his emotions get the better of him, and in leaving them alone, he was able to protect them from himself. Most of the characters are like this, not only the magical ones. So many distraught, beleaguered people living in the wake of past trauma and the devastation of the flood immediately present as terrifying or even insane, but quickly reveal their humanity in segments constructed to deconstruct those initial assumptions. I appreciate the game for doing this because it's such a base human behavior that helps no one. And yes, people are weird, and a handful are genuinely irredeemable. There are people who only intend to cause harm, but they're the people who make sure of that themselves. People who maliciously wield power over others, people who can't imagine others complexly, or worse, as human. And really, you can't rely on other people to do that stuff anyway. You gotta carve out a space yourself. Interstate 35 is a modern Southern Gothic, a brisk visual novel that envisions an America reeling from the devastation of a nuclear accident. It's a moody, reflective experience, and owing to its genre status, leverages the written word and tight scoring to engross the player. It's a searing read that captures the horror of human hubris. This world was no one's for ruining, but here it lies, and no one to blame in particular. America's ace card, the pillar of its imperial ambitions, imploding the heart of the nation. Beyond the macro view, however, is an intimate story of returning, recalling long-buried memories, finding your roots. I want to highlight the game because there aren't many Southern Gothics in video games, but also because it speaks to the broader strokes at play here. We are tumbleweeds, collecting what we roll over and losing what we can no longer support. To write introspectively about the West, even the modern West, is to engage in conversation with the past, to negotiate the future. If our homes can no longer house us, where do we go? Do we escape? Pave over? Build atop? How much of our past is formative and how much of it is worth clinging to? And in a world so aloof, we make our own art and tell our own stories so that God can't deny where we've been. Contemporary Weird West video games interrogate these things as well, and while none of them tell the story quite the same, they couldn't anyway. Each is a different version of events, strands in a larger tapestry that account for a reclaimed social history of the American frontier. If you're still wondering why south of Midnight, Interstate 35, these Southern Gothics are featured here, or missed the history on the Western, imagine South of Midnight were a movie, and not a video game. Imagine it was pitched to a studio back in the golden era of Western film. south of midnight, Interstate 35, would not have happened. The money people, the publishers, would have said, no, women can't function in the leading role because that's obscene, filling their heads with ideas and making men look worse merely by standing in that position. Black people can't act in anything but humiliating caricature because Southern theaters won't screen the thing otherwise, even if the story is fundamentally representative of the American South. Having a black woman talk to her white grandmother implies miscegenation, which was strictly against the Hays Code. South of Midnight could not have existed as a film then, except potentially in a low-budget studio by black audiences for black audiences. I feel that it's important to acknowledge the progress America has made since that time, the Western world in general, really. Video games are thoroughly modern in terms of history. We talk retro consoles and point back to 80s games as ancient, but for example, China has existed as an empire for thousands of years. Depending on how you count it, the USA has been around for less than 300, and it's maybe worth realizing how short the gap between the earliest video games and true African-American enfranchisement in the United States was. Some of the earliest recognizable computer games, arcade games, whatever term you like, were released in 1958 and 1962. At the federal level, total African-American enfranchisement legislation wasn't passed until 1965, which was necessary because many states found ways to circumvent and deliberately undermine those rights. And it was resisted heavily and violently in the South, because even though black voters were officially recognized in northern states before the 1900s, the South clung to its old hatreds and assumptions, to the status quo, believing African Americans to be lesser by birth. It wouldn't just be, I disagree with putting a black person on video game box art. It would be, why would you ever do this? And how dare you do this? Of course, those hateful people never bothered to look into the actual systemic and environmental factors that economically stifled the people they so despised. No, they got to hate for free, taking America as a concept for granted, a natural order that merely sorted itself out, mysteriously ignoring that not only did American slavery atomize African families and cast them to the winds, people who were already poached from their homes, further dispersed all across the states and out of contact with one another, but worse, bad property legislation denied African Americans the ability to own property, once again corrected by federal mandate to counteract bad actors in various states, as late as 1968, later than some of the earliest video games ever released. To put that in perspective, denying them the ability to accrue generational wealth, one of the most consistent predictors of good outcomes in people, because that's the economic framework we live within. The American dream is long dead. You don't simply rise up the corporate ladder freely and meritocratically no matter how much blinkered idiots want to pretend that's universally true. So when the current administration of the United States of America makes a pledge to return to meritocracy because, quote, woke and DEI agendas have simply gone too far, I'm left to laugh in the black fucking irony of the situation. They've managed to convince a non-insubstantial portion of the American people that DEI-A legislation, that is, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility legislation, including wheelchair ramps in case you're curious, is somehow implanting non-white persons into positions they don't deserve, when the reality is the legislation exists explicitly to prevent unqualified white persons from being handed those jobs over other qualified individuals, regardless of race or gender. They conflate DEIA initiatives with affirmative action, which is a really embarrassing conflation of two distinct concepts. When billionaires and other wealth-class assholes walk on podiums today and tell you everybody else is leeching off of them, I need you to understand that these people were not born great, did not act greatly, but were instead born with a silver spoon in their mouth, suckling from the teat of privilege, never having to rise meaningfully to any challenge, and borne aloft by the strength of 1,000 safety nets. And these are the people telling you that everyone's gone woke and desperately trying to bury the reality. Big surprise, some of the most bad faith research about climate change is funded by Exxon. I wonder how they got to that conclusion. Well, I guess I would try to bury the truth too, if I knew the ghost of history was about to paint its pages with my shrinking, shrieking legacy. I know I'm getting old, and nothing really makes me feel older than terrible, terrible opinions about media that are baseline cruel, incurious, and unempathetic. Part of what I love about these collected games, or at least a number of them, is their willingness to buck the historical trend and give women a role. The fiction didn't start it. Calamity Jane and other prominent women did way back when. The Deadlands manual has a brief word on it, allowing women onto the fictional stage and immediately rebuffing anyone who would cry, "Unrealistic," by acknowledging, softly, that this is a fictionalized historical setting and some weird stuff happens in it. But I actually think it doesn't go far enough. It's games like Weird West that actively place Jane into the role of gunslinger, undermining the expected character, one who responds to her husband's call for help, that actively challenge the narrative. Nobody said a woman couldn't shoot, so she does. The Onirist Order is also entirely women and are tasked with guiding the fate of the West itself. Here, women aren't better knowing, perpetually confident girl bosses or whatever. They're murderers, ideologically skewed, and they're active participants in the chaos of the setting. It's awesome. They're not glorified, they're humanized. Evil West doesn't even question Amelia's place in the group, not once. She's educated and frankly knows more about plenty, and this doesn't cause a problem or force a pecking order dispute. Jesse just begrudgingly respects her and her contributions. That alone is an incredible leap compared to the past. Hard West 2 gives us multiple women characters with unique abilities and worth, and even encourages the player to get to know them better. And there's South of Midnight, Hazel Flood, firmly in the protagonist's place, a woman. And in a game that's unconcerned with appealing to a majority of players, more interested in being authentic to itself and its roots, and existing boldly and empathetically in a space historically dominated by the utmost pernicious resistance to advancements for both this character's race and gender. I think back to how women have been portrayed historically in film, and especially in the Western, as victims, as damsels, as prizes, and far too rarely as competent, functioning people. And even now, it's controversial. When a new movie comes out with a, quote, strong female protagonist, this is seen as some kind of propaganda, or capitulation to lesser minds, appeasement, according to the absolute worst subset of people, which is fascinating because it implies outright some very key attitudes about women. Things like, women aren't strong, can't be strong, shouldn't be in the lead role, shouldn't presume to achieve more than their lowly birth would allow for. I'm sick of seeing all these women in these roles. This is unrealistic. This is stupid. Even if corporations are willing to weaponize backlash to their own projects in this way, the words that come out of people's mouths are revealing regardless. I figure that kind of sentiment is bred from insecurity. I might also be insecure if I were effectively like the main character of media since I was a child and suddenly found there was an interest in moving past the norm of me as the main character. And if I also thought like a child might. And it's frustrating because there's this implication that women in leading roles is somehow turning into an overcorrection. Like it's acknowledged that, sure, for the most part, women haven't been in this role much in the past, but it's way too much now, which, in the face of history, simply isn't true. This directly ties into how people of non-white ethnicities factor into popular American media as well. Nowadays, if a cast is largely African American or led by someone who isn't white, or a non-white actor is playing a role that was established as white initially, it's woke. And further than that, it's erasure. And to the past 2 points, that strong women in media has become a hard overcorrection, and that non-white actors playing white roles qualifies as erasure, I can only strongly say that you can't erase anything about the reality of American media. It's not just mostly white, it's palpably, visibly, nigh universally white. The grand sum of most American media, from comics to books to films to games, is hard alabaster, and it's not a question. You can't erase the whiteness. Nobody is being threatened here. Letting artists tell diverse stories is a necessity in any version of America that's willing to be realistic about itself, about its origins, about who founded the nation and who built the nation and who currently occupies the nation. It's never been an ethno-state, and quite frankly, when its own history was crunched down into a more palatable white version, you'd think people would be more interested in a mature, nuanced look at things instead of the same old lies. And you usually get a response like, well, studios should make original stories about original characters instead of doing this. Well, they did. It's called South of Midnight, and it got plastered with the woke label in seconds by a group of people sycophantically repeating the exact same sentiments as the current administration running America, the most powerful people in the United States. It has nothing to do with original work. People don't care about original work half the time, would much rather engage with nostalgic things than seek novelty, and frankly, if it takes inserting new identities into old stories, I think that's a greater social good in terms of empowering people to see themselves in tales considered foundational to contemporary America, than praying that publishers decide to run with whatever new, unproven concept only for people to never show up. Of course, I realize I'm trying to reason with people who don't want to be reasonable. They want disparate voices to shut up. They want other narratives to disappear. There's also a pesky sort of nerd type involved in this discussion, the one who wishes everyone wouldn't care so much and doesn't really get why everyone is so upset, why everyone is so invested, when the bare reality is that all of this intersects directly with American history. Old wounds fester. I think preserving diverse people's visions of the West, old or not, is crucial for maintaining the integrity of American history, especially at a time when lawmakers seem ready and willing to purge certain aspects from textbooks in a way that's transparently ideologically motivated. Banning anything that fits a too broad definition of critical race theory in classrooms in certain red states is the kind of entirely pathetic, ahistorical sort of dismissiveness one expects from the Republican Party. Why have legitimate economic policy when we can wipe out the inconvenient aspects of the American myth, and as a result, preserve the illusion of white exceptionalism and socially other, whatever convenient scapegoat we can point to? After all, we need education-hating workers to grease the cogs of industry and uninformed people to support our administration, and now that we've set up society with a transparent gating mechanism, paid post-secondary education that many high-paying jobs are locked behind, we need an ignorant voter base and our fascistic mockery of democracy to wield their only democratic right in a way that would sustain the status quo. And they'll wake up a little too quickly from their fixation on our various scapegoats if they're educated, so history's gotta go. These kind of cheap attacks exist in a nexus of bullshit, ranging from anti-woke rage bait to badly motivated policy. All of it is unserious and only serves to empower people predominantly interested in consolidating power. The fact that people twice my age can't see this, presumably from a lack of education and inquiry, is enough to make me think the species is doomed. It can't even look back critically at its own history without wincing. It's a culture that thinks being direct, specific, and honest about events in the past somehow constitutes a personal attack on present-day white people. Unapologetic patheticism. Having to sit and listen to people disingenuously type behind their computer screen that nobody is oppressed in America and racism is solved is astounding. Actually lower-level thinking, like a total inability to recognize and acknowledge that other people simply have different experiences. If you've ever been with a woman, or been a woman, you know that not everyone is equally comfortable walking outside at night, depending on the location. It's not hard to imagine, then, knowing what we know about attitudes towards various non-white persons, that feeling unsafe as a minority in the United States is probably the norm, depending on where those people live. It's not hard to imagine, knowing that people unironically write unfounded race realist talking points on the internet, that someone in a position of power, a boss maybe, might have discriminatory hiring standards. Oppression does not have to be direct to be oppression. If you're being smothered in 100 small ways, you're still going to have problems breathing. South of Midnight was predictably caught up in an absolute torrent of toxic posts from embarrassing Steam curators, bad faith reviewers, commenters, and other people who let themselves get swept up by inflammatory grifters. South of Midnight is woke. South of Midnight is anti-white. Stories spun up off incredibly spurious, poorly interpreted statements of, like, one of its staff members venting, presumably about this exact kind of bullshit that is legitimately exhausting and shouldn't exist, but people have decided that being bland, easily propagandized, mediocre dead-enders is a righteous and genuine path to take in life. The world isn't bad because of the incredibly obvious socioeconomic framework sucking every ounce of money from your wallet in 10,000 ways and poisoning the planet. No, it's actually like black people in media. That's the issue. It's incredible how much outrage, actual piss-baby aggrievement comes spilling into public forums the minute a piece of art is directed towards a group of people who will appreciate it more than the majority. It, and the other games featured here that actually deal with diverse perspectives, are not white exclusionary. They simply aren't. The game doesn't contain a pop-up like white, yes or no, and force quits if you agree. It's a story about African Americans that African Americans are more likely to connect with. It's tapped into Southern culture in a way that other games simply have not attempted. It's inherently artistically valuable for that contribution alone. I feel like pushes for representative media aren't taken seriously because they imply that something is wrong. And God forbid something be wrong in the domain of my ivory tower. That and these pushes don't concern people who should, by all accounts, be concerned. You know, your schools, your education system isn't giving you all the information. In some cases, that information's being hobbled, directly removed. Like, we love talking about banned books and fetishizing that material, but how about the actual historical information being excluded from our high school history textbooks? If you take the time to fish around for minority accounts and social history, there's a surprising amount of material on the subject. One person whose contributions earned him awards and the praise of prominent advocates for the Black community is William Loren Katz, now passed, who wrote extensively on the Black experience of the Old West, as well as a series of essays centered on geopolitics, critiquing the myths obfuscating the reality of American imperialism. And I want to highlight this person and their body of work because these voices are important and are worth enshrining in the tapestry of American history. Entry after entry in this text illustrates influential and well-storied people of African descent, name after name, people who worked within the constraints and bigotry of a majority white society that was rife with very old ideas and a justice system skewed against them. In one example, a famous man of African heritage born to an enslaved mother became a member of an indigenous tribe and a storied warrior, but when this real human being was represented in the 1991 film Tomahawk, he was played by a white actor. I want to be clear here in case this has seemed frivolous until now. Filmmakers often drew inspiration from historical stories, but that does not mean they did their homework or cared to actually represent people adequately. Another section explains how the Union General James Lane assembled a multicultural fighting force and marched on Missouri and won several battles against the Confederate forces in the name of emancipation. There's a staggering number of accounts of lived lives, both African and indigenous, and part of the value lies in acknowledging that despite the narrative crafted, the worth of contributions made by either party, Indians, still enslaved people of African descent, fought amongst themselves. Acknowledged. It's why I like The Weird West, the game specifically. You take on the lives of these diverse peoples, and the game does not innately elevate you to hero status. That's determined by your actions and choices, instead of merely acting like people of non-white descent are innately good and always sympathetic. No one is saying that. Championing diverse perspectives is allowing the reality to exist. And this is the story the Black West ultimately tells. It doesn't set out to be explicitly sympathetic. Look at how badly these people were treated. We truly are monsters. Instead, it lays out the facts using historical accounts, letters, photographs, and compiles a more complete picture of the American frontier by including people traditionally excluded. It doesn't gloss over the ugly bits, and while it's true that people of African ancestry were less likely to be villains during the eras they faced significant social challenges, because it would have been fatal, by the time we reach the Wild West, the frontier as we know it, significantly more legends and cattle rustlers, outlaws, and other ne'er-do-wells appear in the records, which is important. It truly seems like the much-touted white racial superiority was not at the heart of Black slavery and disenfranchisement or the displacement of indigenous groups, but rather a fear that those people could do exactly as much as anyone else, given the social context to do it. There are real people, genuine historical records of lives lived on the American frontier and some of its oft-forgotten inhabitants. There's an absolute wealth of these, women, African Americans, indigenous peoples, almost entirely ignored, forgotten about, treated as irrelevant, and it's left to particularly interested scholars to uproot and stamp into the broader cultural narrative because the only stories anybody cares to hear about are the same tired stories that spawned a cultural archetype so strong it's in Overwatch. That's the version of America people accept as canonical that bleeds into normative fiction, because it's become the dominant version. It's why I bristle so immediately in reaction to people concerned like, Black people and women are getting special treatment. They just aren't. There needs to be some kind of corrective force taken in terms of representation, even if it feels like an overreaction, because it's justice. and most of the Weird West titles I've highlighted in this video, depressingly, come out of European countries. People who looked at the West and saw potential, possibility, instead of another chance to vomit tropes. So much of the horror in the Weird West, even the ones that aren't explicitly designed as horror films, seems childish. Vampires, werewolves, robots. At the root of these impossible elements is a more abstract fear. Fear of something ending, moving on, and entirely out of one's control. Fear of change. Fear of evil, something entirely opposed to one's existence, completely unrecognizable and wholly contrary. These fears are the ultimate opposition in the Weird West. The pathos that manifests the monster. The fear that fate, the Wild West, was never yours to begin with. This tendency functions as a stunning critique of the Western as it historically existed, in a framework painted so singularly white and male, in a framework so rigid and time-honored. Imagining the possibility of change must necessarily provoke fear. Imagining that forces greater than you conspire against you is crushing. In such a specific, trope-laden genre, daring to break the mold and buck the expected can only instill horror. A pithier person than me might say, in a sarcastic tone, "Oh, wow, the real monsters were us all along." And it's close, but still wrong. Blood West's dirtbag protagonist is not the monster. What he represents, the cultural attitudes and conditions that created him, and thereby the central conflict, the very root of all evil, his context, is the horror. In Deadlands, the populace's own fears and insecurities are weaponized against them by beings far beyond their reach or understanding. Their context is the horror. In Weird West, you ultimately fight against the annihilation of the entire human species in the name of a handful of disaffected people who sit at the top, dissatisfied and uncaring, simply because they stopped attempting to live, stopped interrogating what it means to be mortal. In Weird West, more than any of the enemies, the monsters, in Weird West, your context is the horror. In Hard West and its sequel, you fight bandits who've done you wrong, demons you're embroiled with off the hop, and even manifestations of your character's inner struggles. In Hard West 2, at least, your context is the horror. In Evil West, you're locked in an intractable conflict with decidedly murderous creatures who have no other satiating form of sustenance and eventually gain the power to snuff them out entirely, forcing them on the offensive. In Evil West, your context creates the horror. And in South of Midnight, you heal the land of its twisted, knotted energies instilled directly by human pain and suffering. In South of Midnight, the people you help and their context, including your own damaged relationship with your mother, is the horror. A long time ago now, I got a comment on my old, rough Dishonored video that stated, "I think developers need to realize that putting a black woman on the box tanked its sales," or something to that effect. Now, I have no idea if that person was badly motivated. Maybe they were just, being realistic about gamers, because yes, that can be a challenge, and there are cases where developers have gone with a whiter, possibly balder protagonist to reach broader potential appeal. Sure. This comment has stuck with me ever since, because for all I know, that person is badly motivated. That person is enraged or perturbed or disgusted that a black woman is on the front of a Dishonored game, and more than that, acts as the main character for that one title. And it's bugged me for so long because that character wasn't invented for that entry. Billy Lurk appears in the very first Dishonored game as the right hand of Dowd, famous assassin, in the DLC. Not every player would have encountered her, not every player stuck around for the DLC, but Dishonored is good, and the DLC is great. And Billy was a character long established in the series. She's highly relevant to the sequel and appears throughout as a confidant. So when someone says, "Ugh, some black woman," either unaware that it's Billy or unable to accept her as a meaningful replacement for the white guy, I can only sit in my uncomfortable silence thinking, this is a real person with real pathological hang-ups that defy basic reason. They either can't think, won't think, or they're hateful. And that haunts me. Because it's not just that person. It's a pervasive attitude that you see from what you presume is a loud minority in public forums and comment sections. I don't want to hear that the whole anti-woke deal is a fringe movement or a fragment of a minority or not worth discussion. These attitudes are stamped firmly into the contemporary American psyche as reflected by a current administration that openly supports these kinds of attitudes. it's reflected in policy. We live in an era where the current regime of the United States of America decided on a whim to slash funding at the drop of a hat to innumerable funding programs and expel so many government workers in the name of reducing wasteful spending. Spending for people who make up the nation, people who pay taxes, people who the framework of civil society is supposed to protect. The United States is the richest country in the world. We live in an era where deportations are suddenly skyrocketing, with students who might potentially, maybe, I guess, not agree with United States foreign policy suddenly being disappeared by the government. And while the administration has faced legal challenges and some of this evil is being undone, the standing president and his party ultimately decided on an action that history would define as fascism regardless of context. We live in an era where textbooks are being tossed or overwritten in the name of purging anything that might be mildly critical of the role white Europeans and their ancestors played in brutalizing multiple populations of current-day America, of real human beings in the name of greed-driven expansionism and empire building. If you tell the truth, well, that's white guilt, and you shouldn't feel guilty about something you never did. Sure. Nobody was talking about guilt, though. They were just being realistic about the facts. They were just explaining history. And you call that an agenda? For every accusation, a confession, huh? This is a nation that somehow managed to remove in some parts of the country as lawmakers in red states decide that factual information constitutes some kind of confabulated woke agenda. Basic coverage of the forced displacement of indigenous groups, the Trail of Tears, the imperialist actions necessary to birth the nation every other nation mutters about today. This is a people that's increasingly willing to look at, with plain derision, any attempt to decolonize popular media or dare to tell diverse stories. I feel such a pull to these Weird West games because, as far as history is concerned, it's the people's version of the American myth, at least in this current era. The raw and uncut take, the one that's somehow, against all conceivable sense, supplementing American history books, particularly at a time when those history books are threatened. The dominant fiction of the United States, the Western, whitewashed and wallpapered over any kind of representative take on its own people and their diverse perspectives. It's taken us until this modern era of video games, challenging traditional narratives with more considerate voices to honor people as people and give them a home in the Old West. And even then, locked behind the subgenre veneer of weird. It isn't enough. Video games are the great confluence of culture. More than the diverse kinds of art that form the basic elements of any game, they also allow for all perspectives, disparate visions, and critical human context. They're massively available, and arguably more accessible than books at a time when literacy is on the decline and more engaging for a not insignificant number of people. Aside from maybe TV, video games are what most younger people are doing. In more crass terms, video games are the highest grossing entertainment industry. They matter. What better place than to discuss culture, politics, and history? What better place to ask questions about the past? At a time when so much academia is pay-gated and ferreted away in digital libraries, when the means to educate yourself freely are under direct attack, video games are, if only slightly, a home in the face of the horror.
Hey, it's K-Bash. Huge thanks goes out to my $4 patrons. Check them out. Beautiful. And double special thanks goes to my extra generous patrons who are Adam Welch,
Air Pirate Sid,
Acropolion,
Alfred Coria,
All
the Singularities,
Alpha 42,
Ampersand,
Andrew Redacted,
Angel Rivera,
Anthony,
Aria,
Aaron, Arschwasser,
Ashley, my wife, my darling. I asked K-Bash to make you smile. Also, hi, Merrick.
Azrael,
Azura,
Atticure, Axin 8,
Bear Skeleton,
Basement Dweller,
Bosch 7,
Ben M,
Beguile,
Big Papa Spray,
Blake Against the Machine,
Wargle Hargle,
Blossom Dante,
Boom Dead,
BH Operator,
Born in Shadow,
Brandon S,
Brendan
Hesse,
British Gooch,
Cow, Cajun Lady,
Cakesar, Can I cuss on here?
Cedo,
Cat Girls Are Real,
Caesar T,
Hero Hero,
Court Fox,
Cordit,
Chris Bromo,
Cody Gold. Colby,
Comfy Moogle,
Couch MOBA,
Crabmonger, Fish Finagler,
Crashgers,
Crater, Crispy J,
Mono 19D,
Cup of the Puppa,
CW Glassworks,
Denny Pangos,
Danky Steak,
Swaggy
David
Bat,
Castillo,
Dara,
Dash Granny,
Decode,
Deadward,
Dead,
The
Strega,
Dingus
Don't read
Bat,
this out loud. Oh no, he did
Doodle
it!
Flu,
Doug
Prince,
DJ, Professor K,
Dr. Cullen PhD,
Drop the Bait, the protagonist, Dylan Winston, El Jaguar,
Elias,
Elpio,
Elsa, Emperor Pickle,
Empty Tenchi, Eric Monticello, Excalibur Shine, Exorian Hagen,
Gnar,
Fail Knight, American's just happy to be
Ferns
here,
Maximum,
Fuzillion, Forte Noir, Frog Vorbis, Frosty_Gamer_, Gary Guaranteed, Gigglebite, Lasses Kohai,
Glyph Seeker,
9cat,
Gobo
Bobo,
Goose 6112,
Gregor 700,
Gray the Darkest Black,
Corey, Gucci Plant,
Hatsune Miku's Crack House,
Archive,
Demon, Game and Station,
Hermit J,
Pixie, Hebe,
Honey Mutts,
Horn Tiger,
How do you know?
Huey.
just took 7 grams of magic mushrooms and now I'm lost in the woods!
I'm supporting K-Bash just because I wanted to make this part of the video longer.
Inferno Galore,
Ingenious Cloud.
IOPG,
I punched a sandwich.
It's not bad.
It's time to sue.
It's not good.
Ivy Ruth Langley.
Jack Hydrate,
Jacob.
Jalopy,
James.
Jank Dankins,
Jason Lasky.
Jaden, James Vaughn,
Jar of Screaming Eyes.
Jay Drito, JL Savarus,
Jay Deus. JK Hedgehog.
John Bo the Joker,
Jordan Joyner.
Jorzy Burden, Juicy Frost,
June.
Gadoken,
Kai Zeta Slow.
K-Chan,
K-Bash's best K. Keegan Too Cool.
Keith the Thief,
Kata Snack.
King Kuma,
Keej.
Knight Pipe, Kitty Caddis,
Clock.
K-Noe,
Cone 2020.
Rating,
Crazy Dark Chocolate.
Cropperton,
Ice.
Kyle, not that Kyle, KZ Excellent, Lady Weed,
Laundry Mom.
Lego Sid,
Lethal Nibbles.
Linkle,
Little Big Trouble.
Loathsome Dung Eater,
Juan.
Low Res,
Low Fat Moger. Lucas Boy.
Blood Mac James, Lunatic,
Magic Meows.
Malamatic Wolf, Mama Rollin, Manapool, Manic Pixie Space Pirate, Now Fever, Mara Ganger,
Marcules.
Marcus Rambles, Maxwell B, Maximum Dog, Meaty Smack, Mechanized Memories, Maple Puppet, Mega Boy E Nasty, Melly 10, Metal Gear Gaseous, Michelle Citrano, Mike DeViar, Mikusagi, Moa, Bobby Dobby, Big Titty Gop, GF Cooley,
Monochrome Only.
Monochrome Rainbow, Morgana Black, Maury, Mort,
Modi.
Mr. Pee Pee Poo Poo Kaka,
Mr. Yeety Dabface McYoink Bomb.
Mirna.
Nyranu. Nito Torpedo.
Neon Dwarf, Nick Krishna, Nifty Rex,
Not Nobel.
Nuggy, Okami,
Old Burgle. Old Man Cranberry.
Ollie.
Omni Nerd Zero.
137,
Only LK.
The Plant, Oscar, Paperlandy,
PBK.
Pandemic Cowboy, Pelagic Undulation,
PK Gaming.
P-Mike,
Popular Hitman. Prismatic Dan.
Pringle, Pringle, Probably not Grady,
Project Darklight.
Punch Fighter Champion,
Honosaurus Rex. Quasar McDougal. Quillworth.
Raging
Real
Ataraxia,
Beans. Reggie Rodriguez.
Renteca Bond,
Ringed Relay.
Rowlet's Bowtie,
Roylondo.
RP Gamer,
Ryan Michel.
Saigon Man, Salsa,
Salty Smasher.
Gabrius,
Scribe Slendy. Sakai no Award.
Sensual Coder, Saphirium,
Sexy Bionicle GF.
Josh,
Nintendo.
Shut up, Wesley,
Silver Bear 909.
Sin,
Sin. God.
Sir Doodle's alive. Seriously tired of waiting in line.
Sir Newton.
Sir Slurpsalot.
Sir Speedster.
Skyward Lead.
Sleepy Wabbit.
Slippy Sloppy Bippy Boppy.
Snart. Small Turtle House.
So Zeta Dad.
Sock'em Bopper.
Suckdolager.
Space Lizard.
Spider Dad.
Squidged. Squishword.
Star Night Sky.
Streffin Battles.
Super Dingus.
Super Sandwich Guy.
Teotoxin.
George Chubbington.
Terrence Swift.
The Big Bubby.
The Clown Prince of Cringe.
The good Lord has blessed me. Hallelujah.
The Green Loki.
The
Crispy Boy.
The Peacemaker Pyro.
The Salt
The
Knight. Nomad.
The Real McCoy.
The Toasted One.
Dick
This is the Monato's Power.
Fresh. Rips Heart.
Tiggles McGuffin.
Tim Lobster. Timid the Writer.
Tony Jones, the legend.
Total Play. Travis Edwards.
Twiddle Chungus.
Ty Guy 9001.
Type A Grapefruit.
Vid.
Vacant Plaza.
Valenris.
Venom.
Vice Plot.
Video Gore.
Vic.
Joaquin, get right in my bag.
Wapoza.
Wayne is boss.
We are so K-back.
Weed trash.
Waylon.
Where am I? Help.
Whiskey Dono.
Widgie.
Winter Solstice.
Wood TV.
Wrenchim. Zanny Tanner.
Shion D. Stravius.
Yero 12.
Yashichi.
Yay Kundo. Zachary Livesey.
Zachary Z.
Zanasso.
Zane the Impure.
Zane the Pure.
Zed Slayer Gamer.
Zero Salazar.
Zenova.
Cyberbunk.
If you'd like to help support the show, unlock new long-form projects, and help me keep improving, check out my Patreon. We got lots more videos in store. Stay tuned for more. K-Bash out.